is a native of Vancouver, British Columbia. He graduated in medicine from the University of British Columbia. He is currently an associate professor of family medicine at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. A practicing family physician, Dr. Seidelman was the founding medical director of Hamilton's first community health center, where he continues to be based. Two of Dr. Seidelman's interests have been the development of health policy and services and the influence of Nazi medicine. He has recently written 2 papers on Nazi medicine, Mengele Medicus, Medicine's Nazi Heritage, which was published last year in the Millbank Quarterly and will be republished soon in the International Journal of Health Services. Second article, entitled The Medical Selection, Auschwitz Antecedents and Effluent, which will be published soon in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He is also the author of an essay recently published in the Holocaust Memorial Day edition of the Jerusalem Post, entitled Twins, Jewish Twins, Auschwitz and Jerusalem. Dr. Seidelman will show a few slides, and it may be difficult for some of you in some parts of this room to see the slides on the far wall. We apologize for this, but need to tell you that the lighting for this room and the arrangement for this room has really been structured in order to serve the purposes of the TV production for this conference. So we apologize if you have some difficulties in seeing the slides. Next we will be hearing from Rabbi Irvin Weiss. Rabbi Weiss is Executive Director of B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation at the University of Minnesota, and he is also the President of the Council of Religious Advisors here at the University. He has been very active in the design for this program today. Finally, we will hear from Dr. Ronald Cranford. Dr. Cranford is a neurologist and a medical ethicist at Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. He is widely known for his work in the areas of termination of medical treatment, the determination of death, and the use of hospital ethics committees. Dr. Cranford is chairman of the Ethics and Humanities Committee of the American Academy of Neurology. He is past president of the American Society of Law and Medicine. He served as a member of the Hastings Center panel that produced the guidelines for termination of treatment. He is co-author of the article that was published March 30th in the New England Journal of Medicine, which endorsed physician-assisted suicide under some circumstances. And I'd like to add that Dr. Cranford is a special friend of the Center for Biomedical Ethics, and that he was instrumental in the creating of the center and continues to be actively involved in many of our center's activities. So I'd like to invite each of the panel members to take up to 20 minutes to comment on the topic of medical killing by the Nazis. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like personally to express the honor I felt in terms of being invited to participate in this conference today, and I'd like to congratulate Arthur Kaplan and the conference organizers in arranging this. Having been involved in a rather futile attempt a couple of years ago, I'm aware of the complexities involved in such an endeavor. I'd also, at the outset, before starting my paper, just like to pay tribute to a couple of people here who will be participating later. One is Benno Muller-Hill, who is a scientist, philosopher, and historian, and Benno, I feel, has done the major important work in the area, and what I am doing is just commenting. Also Robert Proctor, whose work, his book, is a major contribution in the field and will be speaking later today. My brief paper is entitled Murder as Med-Speak, Euthanasia, Medicalized Killing, and Medical Experimentation in Nazi Germany. Nazi medicine challenges the foundation of medicine today. Before modern medicine can deal with the issues of medicalized killing and euthanasia, it must first come to terms with its Nazi heritage. Medicine has yet to recognize what Nazi medicine was or its implications for today. Nazi medicine was not a mutant chimera in the long distinguished history of medicine. It was not an aberration that arose in 1933 and disappeared in 1945. It was not an anomaly relevant only to Nazi Germany. Nazi medicine had its origins in the same academic and professional environment that influenced the development of the healthcare systems of the developed world. Nazi medicine arose from what was probably the most medically advanced and sophisticated country in the world at that time. Scientific medicine as we know it today developed in large part in 19th and 20th century Germany. Abraham Flexner, the man considered to be the architect of the medical education system in the United States and Canada, considered the German university to be an example of how science and education could merge in the teaching of medicine. Nazi medicine arose in that environment. The medical practitioners of evil were graduates of those same German universities admired by Abraham Flexner. Nazi medicine thrived in the healthcare system that gave the world socialized medicine. Nazi medicine did not die on the gallows at Nuremberg. Its influence continues until this very day. Nazi medicine challenges the basis of the relationship of the physician to human life. In order to better understand the anatomy of that relationship, medicine must also study the pathology of that relationship by dissecting and analyzing the worst hour in the history of the profession, 1933 to 1945. Nazi medicine challenges the very roots of the centuries-old culture of medicine. I will briefly review some of the challenges to the culture of medicine by examining some specific examples of that culture, namely language, institutions, symbols, and social hierarchy. Language. Medicine has its own formal vocabulary that defines organ systems, procedures, and diseases. It also has its own informal language or euphemism. 3 of these euphemisms from Nazi medicine are incorporated into the language of this conference: medicalized killing, euthanasia, medical experiments. In the context of Nazi medicine, these 3 terms are euphemisms or med speak for murder. That is what we are really talking about, murder. Nothing less. It was state-inspired murder that probably would not have achieved what it did without the active complicity of the medical profession. It was a program of medical murder in which physicians defined the victims, selected the victims, designed the instruments of death, experimented on the victims, killed the victims, and exploited the victims' bodies before, during, and after their murder. It was a program of mass murder which began when physicians decided that human life was of differential value. It was a program of medical murder which began when medicine and society saw race as a metaphor for disease. And yet, the language of medicine cannot seem to express the reality of medical murder. We should therefore at the outset express clearly in our language what the terms medicalized killing, euthanasia, and medical experimentation in Nazi Germany really mean. An important part of the Nazi medical process of rationalizing murder was the concept of human degeneration. Some human beings were considered to be clinically degenerate, useless eaters, or life without value. The language of medicine incorporated these very concepts as legitimate expressions of clinical judgment. Murder was rationalized on the basis of clinical dehumanization. While the language of degeneracy is no longer part of formal clinical language, the colloquial med-speak of students and house staff of our health sciences centers today includes expressions which imply similar feelings. Gork, Gomer, Spaz, Gomer meaning get out of my emergency room, a term popularized by the novelist Samuel Shem in his book The House of God. Spaws means a subhuman piece of shit. These are expressions which imply degeneracy, which imply that some human beings have lesser value than others. We must examine what there is about our system of professional training, that the culture of the student and trainee fosters these attitudes and expressions. While the language of medicine today may exclude the concept of medical murder, the vernacular med-speak of the wards includes words synonymous with the concept of degeneration. Let us turn from the language of medicine to a symbol, a physician's license to practice. In most countries, the medical license represents state and professional approval of a graduate physician's qualifications. It symbolizes trust in the physician for the patients who attend such a person, and most physicians' offices have the framed license hanging there. That symbol was shattered on the selection ramp at Auschwitz. Professor Muller-Hill, in his book Murderous Science, has pointed out that the SS physicians who were selected to select people on the ramp in the Birkenau death camp were required to be licensed practitioners. Thus, the medical license as a symbol of respect and trust became a symbol of death and destruction. In Nazi Germany, it became a qualification for murder. But during the Hitler period, medical licensure took on a broader perverse meaning. It became a method of professional control and discrimination in Germany and outside. Within Germany, those physicians defined as racially inferior were deprived of their license to practice medicine. Outside Germany, many countries used the licensing process to deprive refugee physicians from the most scientifically advanced country in the world from the opportunity to practice their profession. In pre-war France, the United States, Canada, Australia, England, and the British Mandate of Palestine, the medical license became a symbol of discrimination and control. Recently, in West Germany, control of licensure was used as a form of professional suppression. In that country, a physician in Mainz had his license to practice suspended for having had published a 1986 English language article in the journal The Lancet, an article which raised ethical questions concerning the German medical profession's role in Nazi Germany. That physician is currently practicing in the United States. Let us now consider an important institution in medicine, namely the medical school. Medical schools represent excellence, the best of education, medical science, and medical practice. It was to the German university-based medical schools that physicians made pilgrimage in pursuit of scientific excellence earlier in this century. It was the German university which Abraham Flexner saw as a model for his visionary health sciences center, such as we're sitting in nearby today. It was the German university which saw many of its faculty receive Nobel Prizes for contributions to medicine. It was the same German university which produced Joseph Mengele and Sigmund Rascher and the licensed SS physicians on the ramp at Auschwitz. It was these same German medical schools which employed the professors who legitimized Nazi racial policies. It was these German medical schools that rapidly incorporated racial science into their curriculum. It was these same German medical schools that accepted the cadavers of Nazi victims for anatomical study. It is these same German medical schools which have continued to use these anatomical specimens for study until this day. We cannot dismiss those medical schools in Germany today as being irrelevant to us. They are part of our own heritage. The questions we ask of them concerning their basic value system, we should also be asking of ourselves. We acknowledge the nobility of our heritage in medicine, but we ignore the ignobility. The anatomy specimens in the German medical schools derived from victimized subjects represent a new symbol for medicine. They symbolize the ignobility of medicine. The proposed public burial of these remains should be universally marked by the profession. Every full professor of medicine and every medical student in both German republics should attend such a public funeral. Every medical school in the world should observe a symbolic moment's silence on the day of the funeral, to be followed by an annual commemoration of the anniversary of that event. The establishment of an ethical foundation to medicine requires that the profession recognize and acknowledge evil. Medicine should begin by acknowledging and paying tribute to its victims. One of the social features of the university-based medical school is the academic hierarchy. Successful advancement in the hierarchy is largely dependent upon funded research and publication in recognized scientific and professional journals. As Drs. Muller-Hill and Proctor have shown, in Nazi Germany, it was the professors who provided the scholarly justification for medical murder. It was these professors who established the role models for young physicians in pursuit of an academic career. It was the same professors who took advantage of the program of dehumanization and medicalized murder to advance their own personal scientific careers. Let us briefly look at the legacy of two men who scaled the heights of academic distinction in the German university, Professors Ernst Rudin, whom Dr. Kaplan mentioned yesterday, and Othmar von Verschuer. If you mind looking to your right, the slide for a portrait. The psychiatrist Ernst Rudin, seen here, was a leading psychiatric geneticist whose particular field of interest was the genetics of schizophrenia. In 1916, he was the author of a paper which suggested that schizophrenia was hereditary. Rudin subsequently became a professor of psychiatry at the University of Munich and director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Psychiatry in Munich. Rudin's research into the genetics of schizophrenia served as a foundation for his leadership in developing the eugenic and racist policies of the Hitler regime. He was one of the authors and advocates of the 1933 sterilization law. Rudin viewed the Nuremberg race laws as being a victory for his eugenics movement. At Rudin's Munich Institute, to be a conscientious objector was considered a form of schizophrenia and therefore a qualification for enforced sterilization. Today, Rudin's early work on the genetics of schizophrenia continues to be cited without any consideration of the context of this work or the career of the medical scientist responsible. An example of this occurred recently in the journal Nature, which published 4 papers dealing with the genetics of schizophrenia. Rudin's 1916 paper was cited in one of these papers without any consideration of the historical context of his work. As psychiatry and genetics continue to probe the mystery of the genetics of schizophrenia, they have failed to consider the legacy of a person considered to be a pioneer in the field. A distinctive tradition of academic subculture is that of honoring distinguished academics with a Festschrift, a celebratory volume. One person who had 2 Festschrifts published in honor of his 60th birthday was this man, Professor Dr. Baron Othmar von Verschuer, an internationally recognized authority in human genetics and anthropology. In June of 1939, Verschuer gave an invited lecture to the Royal Society of London. In 1956, at the time this photograph was published, he was the professor and head of the Department of Genetics at the University of Munster. This photograph appeared in a Festschrift published in a Journal of Twin Studies, which featured an editorial honoring Verschuer as master and example, maestro e esempio. It described him as, quote, a master of clear fame and creator of men who dedicate themselves to scientific research with the spirit of a vocation. He is also an example of hard work and discipline for all scientists, and especially for all the geneticists beyond the confines of his school and his nation, close quote. One of the men Verschuer helped to create was Dr. Joseph Mengele, for whom Verschuer was professional mentor and sponsor. As Professor Muller-Hill has discovered, Mengele's Auschwitz research was financed in part by a research grant awarded not to Mengele, but to Verschuer. Specimens were collected from victims in Auschwitz and sent to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology in Berlin-Dahlem, then headed by Verschuur. After the war, Verschuur was denazified and fined as a fellow traveler and permitted to resume his professional career, which he did at Munster. Verschuur's work continues to be cited in the scientific literature without reference to the man or the context of his career. It is through the work of such men as Rudin and Verschuur that Nazi medicine has become part of the professional genotype of medicine today. It is because of people like Rudin, Verschuur, and Mengele that psychiatry, genetics, and twin studies have become immutably tainted by the Nazi period. We must remember that these two symbols of satanic research, namely Joseph Mengele and Sigmund Rascher, conducted their research in order to become distinguished academics like Rudin and Verschuur. They did not work in isolation. What we should be examining today is the academic system that created Mengele and Rascher. We should be studying how the most advanced medical scientific institutions in the world made human life dispensable, where the value of human life became secondary to that of research and academic advancement. What needs to be published and studied today is not the scientific data from the experiments, but a recounting of the consequences of ethical compromise, where human life and dignity became secondary to personal, professional, scientific, and political goals. Perhaps we should consider a new oath, a Dachau oath, which reminds physicians and students of evil and enforces the concept of personhood, as Dr. Katz described last evening. I wish to conclude this paper with a timeless symbol of medicine and the ethical spirit of the profession, the Greek island of Kos. Kos symbolizes the spiritual birthplace of Western medicine. On Kos, one will find the remains of a major temple to the Greek god of medicine, Aesculapius, pictured here. Kos is the mythical birthplace of the Greek physician Hippocrates, who created the paradigm, perhaps mythical as well, of the ethical physician. To this very day, physicians make pilgrimage to Hippocrates' birthplace, many retaking the Hippocratic oath in an ancient ceremony at the temple of Aesculapius, one of these oath-taking ceremonies being pictured here. An oft-visited site in the town of Kos is an ancient plane tree where, legend has it, Hippocrates taught under its branches. Seeds from the plane tree of Hippocrates have been distributed around the world as part of an effort to disseminate the Hippocratic spirit. In the summer of 1944, Kos was occupied by the German military. On the 23rd day of July, the 120 Jews of Kos were assembled at the harbor near the plane tree of Hippocrates. A small vessel arrived to pick them up, afterwards joining other vessels containing the last Jews of Rhodes. From there, they were transported to the Greek mainland, from whence they were conveyed by train to Auschwitz. Upon arrival at the rail siding in the Birkenau complex, the Jews of Hippocrates' birthplace were met on the ramp by the professional descendants of Hippocrates. Those licensed SS physicians who had been selected to select made a diagnosis on each of the Jews of Kos that he or she was a useless life and should receive the great therapy of Auschwitz, which was death in the central hospital of Auschwitz. There they all perished. Today, the island of Kos and the empty synagogue of Kos, which adjoins the plane tree of Hippocrates, symbolize the spiritual crisis of medicine arising from the Holocaust, a crisis that medicine has failed to recognize and let alone resolve. Thank you.
I also want to thank the people responsible in planning this conference for the opportunity to not simply be here personally, but to represent both the Jewish and interfaith religious community at the university. And though in my remarks, which will follow, I will be utilizing Jewish imagery and tradition, I believe, or I hope I will do so, for the purpose of elucidating more universal concerns and issues. There's a very significant relationship between ethics and metaphysics. Some would argue they are one and the same. In medieval philosophy, they were very often treated as similar, if not identical, subjects, or definitely first cousins. And if we allow ourselves to relate to metaphysics as that juncture of the physical and the non-physical world, the worlds of corporeality and the world of non-corporeality, I think we can see how poignant this approach can be in encountering, being engaged by the issues before us at this conference, and obviously many more which we will not have the opportunity to consider. In religious poetic language, one perhaps can describe this area as the bridge between heaven and earth. And indeed, in the times when the temple stood in Jerusalem, on one occasion during the year, the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, and only at that time, which in Jewish tradition is where heaven and earth meet. It's a variation on this omphalos principle, which is shared by other cultures and religions. And if that priest made one wrong move, the high priest, during his visit into the Holy of Holies, he would die. And the question has been asked, well, what went on in there? What was the reality in the Holy of Holies that a wrong move in ceremony by the priest would result in his immediate death and incineration, if you will? There have been a number of responses which I feel are poignant and helpful for us to understand the urgency of the issues we deal with. When people exist at that juncture of the physical and non-physical worlds of earth and heaven, we exist in a place that is very electric and very volatile. And if we make mistakes, they generally are of great significance, including the mistake of non-action. It is a volatile place to be, a place where we know what we think and feel will affect what we do, and also what we do can immediately or ultimately condition our thoughts. I would say just parenthetically that it's interesting that not until recent centuries has there been a separation between the clergy and medicine. Most priests in ancient civilizations were also healers or physicians. And through the medieval period, at least, into the modern era, the greatest religious thinkers, be it in Islam or Christianity or Judaism, were very often also medical people. I think that's another example of an understanding of reality, understanding of the essentiality of acknowledging not only the existence of the physical and the non-physical, but the meeting of the two. The 613 traditional commandments that the rabbis derive from the Jewish Bible, I feel also elucidate the questions before us, because not one of these commandments, not one, it has been pointed out, can be performed without some part of the body. Whether it is prayer or sacrifice, the observance of the Sabbath or the dietary laws, or the observance of the more ethical commandments of charity and honesty, they all involve our bodies. The commandments have been broken down into two categories, and I alluded to this yesterday in my remarks. those which are referred to as positive commandments, mitzvot taseh, and the mitzvot lo ta'aseh, the negative commandments, the thou shalts and thou shalt nots. What is critical to understand is, from a religious perspective, there is always, at any given moment in time and space, something we should do or should not do. This is qualified by time and circumstance. Something that is right to do now may be wrong to do a moment from now. Where it is praiseworthy to not violate the Sabbath by doing any type of work, if there's even a doubt as to the endangerment of a human life, it becomes a commandment to violate the Sabbath and a transgression not to. The issue is that we have to understand our negotiations or our negotiating of reality on a day-to-day basis as a factor of what we do and what we do not do. This is more complicated in the Jewish system and others by making it not a linear system. Namely, it is not only important to acknowledge the effect our thoughts and feelings have on our actions, but to also acknowledge that our actions can influence our thoughts, our feelings. I think this is especially significant if we consider someone doing the right thing now for a certain reason, but years later, those reasons, as lofty as they may be, will not remain. The action will, and it could lead to the endorsement of doing something for the wrong reasons. We have to consider how we contribute to a future value system in our societies by virtue of what we do now. We have to take responsibility for contributing to this future system of values. And we have to be modest enough, I feel, to not assume that the most lofty of incentives, the most logical of reasons which may motivate us, will necessarily motivate those in the future. What will remain is not why, for example, euthanasia may be all right in certain circumstances, but rather that euthanasia will become an accepted practice. It is not a linear system. There are people who perhaps have participated in euthanasia who no longer do because of that experience in the world of action. It has changed their thoughts on this subject. And perhaps others who have decided not to participate in some way in euthanasia after deciding not to, who have arrived at a different conclusion as a result of that decision as well. There's a point, I think, where we not only cross over in terms from the world of ethics to the world of medical and scientific and technological deeds, but also, I think, in thought, many of us living in the late 20th century cross over into a new and potentially frightening, at times adventurous, at times even exciting, but I think awesome territory where we theorize or speculate upon the possibility of a world, a reality which we would not want to live in, where we imagine in our minds a reality of life where death would be better. I think this is an essential exercise. On personal levels, many of us have experienced that. For me, it was when I was 16 and my grandmother was dying of cancer in the mid-60s, And I can remember the moment after days of hearing her scream and moan in pain where I no longer was praying for her healing, but I was praying for the end of her suffering. My understanding of life has never been the same since. But it's a real moment, and I think it's an important, not necessarily obviously pleasant, but an essential experience for the sophistication and refinement of our lives. It's interesting, taking the Greek definition of euthanasia, a good death, to share with you that the rabbis of the Talmud had a similar conception. Indeed, there is such a thing as a good death, and there's a very elaborate and lengthy argument in the Talmud as to when is it right for one to give up his or her life. When is it wrong to continue living? The rabbis were concerned primarily with their, as a result of their awareness and insight in regard, and this is sort of an interesting commentary on situations today, and we're talking about the 2nd century of the Common Era. They were concerned with religious fanaticism. They were concerned with the extreme expressions of martyrdom. They wanted to limit the situations where, according to Jewish law, not Jewish custom, but the Jewish law, where one would be obligated to give up his or her life. But unequivocally incorporated in this halachic, this Jewish legal position, is the understanding that there are times when the better thing to do is not to continue living. They limited it. And there's ethical force behind the 3 situations where it was right for one to give up life. One is if you were given the choice of committing one of the prohibited, participating in one of the prohibited sexual relationships, saying, have intercourse with your mother, or if you're a woman, with your father, and if you don't, we will kill you, then you give up your life. A second one was idolatry. Either accept this idol, bow down to this idol, in the simplest expression, but it proved, as we know, to be much more complex than that. The mass forced conversions, for example, during the Crusades, but that's a subject for another time. That it'd be better, instead of giving up a correct, sanctified, if you will, theology, it's better to die. And the third area is, you kill this person, and if you don't kill this person, I will kill you. Then it's better, instead of committing homicide in this situation, to give up your life. These are situations where indeed there is a good death, and going on living would be questionable from an ethical, religious point of view. It is interesting that the term used for giving up one's life for the right reason has a beautiful linguistic irony, and that is Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. There are other ways to sanctify God's name through living, but the ultimate expression of sanctifying that which is good, which is holy, which is ultimate and eternal, is when you have to make that choice to give up your life because there's something even more important, even better, if you will, than living. I feel this brings us into very sharp confrontation with the fact that in the area of ethics in general, especially in the area of religious ethics, we are confronted in a Buberian sense with the challenge to search out the absolute in a world which is relative. We are challenged to discover that which is eternal, though we are mortal, to participate in something which is infinite, though we are finite. Ethics, at least in a metaphysical sense, is one, perhaps the most efficacious, but definitely at least one of the arenas in which we as human beings are able to do that, to participate in that extremely challenging and yet so essential exercise of finding what is true, what is absolutely true in a world which is relative. To understand ethics, we have to understand theology. Secular ethical humanism is a recent phenomenon. What we refer to as ethical monotheism, beginning in the Jewish Bible, traditionally in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, remains, I think, still a radical consideration. To think of one God in a time and place where traditionally Abraham and Sarah lived is significant enough. But the qualifying factor is that it was an ethical God that was perceived. In principle, one could think, as many have later, that there is one God behind all that is not, but that God really makes no demands of us, that God has no interest in issues of good and bad, right and wrong. It's ethical monotheism, and it's from that tradition of ethical monotheism that secular ethical humanism finds its origin. There are issues relating around euthanasia and other questions which are theologically difficult. There's issues of the randomness of life, or is there a divine scheme, an ultimate purpose to life? If there's an ultimate purpose to life, is there not also an ultimate purpose to someone lingering in a coma with no hope, at least from medical analysis and diagnosis, for improvement? On the other hand, it has been argued that perhaps the purpose of that situation is for us to learn when it is right to terminate a life. That there may be a purpose in this direction as well. There's a theological problem in that one cannot regard God as the creator God. Hashem Natan, the Hashem Lakach, God provides, gives, creates life, and takes life. And also assume, with a good amount of righteousness or self-righteousness, the responsibility to participate in the taking of life, and feeling that one has the ability to know when nothing less than taking life is the right thing to do. I suggest that is a very, very large question, so large that we see it as small or don't see it at all. Because that takes us to the next consideration, which I touched on yesterday, Dr. Kaplan did, Dr. Katz did, namely human frailty, human weakness, human vulnerability, the sin, if you will, in traditional terminology, of hubris, of thinking so much of ourselves that we deceive ourselves into thinking that we are righteous when perhaps we aren't. These are issues that a traditionally based, theologically oriented treatment of this subject would have to deal with. And finally, the issue of God's omnipotence, which is the most core principle of faith which determines whether one could participate in a living will or one could endorse a act of euthanasia. Namely, if God is omnipotent, God can do anything, including reversing physical reality. That is the orthodox position. Why it's unacceptable, because once a person changes his or her position on that, one changes his or her whole outlook religiously on life. Once one modifies one's view on God's omnipotence. There's also no certainty in regard to human knowledge, and this has a theological significance when we deal with questions of God's omniscience. God may know everything, but we don't. As I stated yesterday in the name of Rabbi Hanina ben Dusa, there is no guarantee that as intelligent, as educated as we are, and the paper just read seems to very emphatically and eloquently there is no guarantee that we will behave with a parallel quality on an ethical level. The Nazis, we have to remember, these doctors, these scientists, these researchers, were able to go home and play with their children. They had good appetites and enjoyed good food and wine and music. And it wasn't a medieval society, of course, in which the Holocaust took place. So, I think we have to deal with a question that takes into account an element of modesty and humility, but not to the other extreme where we feel we can do nothing and must not do anything. Dr. Katz last night raised the question, in spite of what can be gained perhaps by using Nazi data, what would be lost is too great, to paraphrase Dr. Katz. The opportunity to make a statement that would be meaningful and influential for generations to come would be lost. We could perhaps ask this question regarding euthanasia. What can be gained by participating in certain forms of euthanasia may be significant. It's not an either-or situation necessarily, but what we would lose in terms of making a statement, in terms of setting precedents, in terms of giving the authorization to others who may come after us without, again, the intentions, the incentives, the thoughtfulness, but simply with the precedents and the authorization to participate in actions void of moral ethical tension. I would only illustrate that with the fact that you can have two physicians participating in euthanasia. One does so with great angst and with full awareness of the magnitude of the challenge, is pained with doubt, is conflicted, and another one does it because it's a cost-effective measure. The result is the same. The result is the same. So I feel in concluding, when we deal with these issues, is that we consider that juncture of the worlds of thought and feeling, the worlds of psychology, the worlds of emotions, of creativity, and how they affect and are affected by the world of physicality. How we negotiate this juncture will affect the negotiation of this juncture in future generations. And I think we have to bring into creative tension a Talmudic teaching in Sanhedrin, which clearly tells us that if you take one life, it is regarded as if you destroyed the whole universe. And if you have saved one life, it is regarded as if you have saved the entire universe. With, I think, a also well-established and respected position on humanity, on human potential to learn and to do what is right, on intuitive knowledge, And I would not want to exclude the in situ, if you will, experience of standing in a hospital room, being there with family, with the patient, with the machinery, with the medical knowledge, and rule out the possibility that indeed there is a time and a place for a good life to end in a good death. However, I would never want to make such a decision without an immense amount of tension, consideration, and allowing for the possibility to admit that I was wrong. Thank you.
Can be done in 30 seconds. Huh? Thank you. I too want to thank the Center for inviting me and for having this conference, and for Art and his colleagues to have the courage and the foresight to sponsor a conference on the Holocaust. As far as I'm concerned, in many respects, Art Kaplan is a medical ethicist in a category of his own in many different ways. In March 30th, New England Journal of Medicine, I and 11 other colleagues published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine on the humane care of the dying. In that article, we talked for about two-thirds of the way about the humane care of the dying. We condemned the current practice of many physicians in the United States who we felt caused a great deal of needless suffering, a great deal of futile prolongation of life, a great deal of loss of control of individuals and families in the dying process. In talking about the balance between suffering and the potential for killing, we felt that most physicians should strike strongly towards the balance of minimizing suffering rather than the concern about killing. The positions we took there, other than the very strong condemnation of current practices, the positions otherwise were very similar to the positions of the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine in 1983, were similar to the Hastings Center guidelines in 1987. So it was really nothing a great deal new in what we said, other than widely and strongly criticizing the medical profession for its current position on a lot of issues. We did take a new step. 10 of the 12 of the group felt that in some situations that physician-assisted suicide was moral. And to be specific, what we said was it is not immoral in some circumstances for a physician to assist in the rational suicide of a terminally ill patient. We knew when we were taking that statement it would be extremely controversial, that probably wouldn't be accepted by the majority of people. We thought long and hard about taking that position. We recognized we were breaking new ground. We spent a great deal of time at the terminology and the substance. On the issue of active euthanasia, it was obvious with our panel of 12 physicians from the United States that there was no consensus whatsoever, that we merely described current practices in the United States and in the Netherlands and took no position on active euthanasia at all. And the question is, why did we take this step? Why did we go one step further and break new ground and say that physician-assisted suicide was moral in some circumstances? First and foremost, the reason we did is because we believed it. We believed that there were circumstances where physician-assisted suicide was the most moral thing to do. If you read our article very, very carefully and look at the entire article throughout, you'll find that we strongly endorse the concept that if there is great humane care of the dying, that if physicians would change their practices and be more concerned about the humane care of the dying in terms of pain, suffering, controlled by the family, there would be a rare circumstance where physician-assisted suicide would be the most moral thing to do. Further, if you read the article and read some of the things I've said and others said, that if there was widespread humane care of the dying, that these instances would be extremely rare, and that some of the greatest pressure for the active euthanasia movement in the United States and elsewhere are coming from the two groups that are most opposed to active euthanasia. The two groups most opposed to active euthanasia, I think, are the medical profession, number one, and the pro-life groups. And I think by these two groups making it difficult for us to develop humane care of the policies and practices of stopping treatment in many circumstances, it gives more and more of a drive towards active euthanasia, both here and abroad. Besides this reason that we believed in what we said, and we discussed rational suicide, by the way, a great deal, and we felt there were unequivocally situations where rational suicide was moral, particularly in the AIDS situation. I think the AIDS had a great deal to do with some of our change in our thinking. But two other reasons why we took the position we did, knowing it was controversial and knowing that the majority of us, majority of you, including this group here, would not maybe agree with us, was number one, was to spark a debate on the question of active euthanasia, similar to this conference, sparking a debate on dialogue on the Holocaust. Part of that reason for taking that position and sparking the debate was the editorial by four prominent medical ethicists in the United States, Dr. Sigler, Cass, Pellegrino, and Galen, who wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1987, after the It's Over Debbie episode, that active euthanasia should not even be discussed, that it was so immoral, that it was so intrinsically wrong, that it was similar to incest and similar to slavery, and it was some subject that was not discussable. And we strongly disagreed with that position. We felt it was important to discuss active euthanasia. It was important to discuss rational suicide because it was occurring. It was occurring here. It was occurring in the Netherlands. It was occurring more frequently in some states than others, Florida, California more frequently, certainly occurring more frequently among AIDS patients and other categories. So number one, we did this intentionally to spark a debate on these issues, just like this conference sparks a debate. Secondly, we were concerned about the hypocrisy and the self-deception that was going on in the United States already. We felt that many physicians that were actively opposed to active euthanasia also caused a great deal of needless suffering in these situations. There was a great deal of discussion about the oath of Hippocrates and whether it was an absolute moral prohibition in the oath of Hippocrates to kill patients. I guess the feeling in general was that probably was a reasonable interpretation of the oath of Hippocrates in terms of absolute prohibition against killing. We also read the oath of Hippocrates as being a prohibition against causing suffering, widespread suffering. And we felt in the United States the physicians now were causing such widespread suffering that we had to look at the balance between the causing suffering versus the question of killing. And we felt that taking this position would point out some of the hypocrisy and self-deception and denial of reality which has been occurring in the United States in terms of the humane care of the dying. Let me contrast for a second the Nazi euthanasia program to the contemporary euthanasia movement to point out that I think, and I think other people have pointed this out already, that the two programs are really disanalogous in many, many fundamental respects. First of all, in terms of the Nazi euthanasia program, it was never intended to benefit the individual. It was only a very thinly disguised effort at the beginning that this was in any way to benefit the individual, first and foremost. Number two, it was never done in a voluntary fashion whatsoever, even at the very, very beginning. It was never pretended to be voluntary. Thirdly, it was obviously never done in terms of mercy, in terms of the suffering of the individual, again, except as a very thinly disguised excuse for the program. Fourthly, it was always done for a social value, that this arose out of the concept of Volk, the abstract concept of the nation, the people, the supremacy of the Aryan nation. So the whole concept of the Nazi euthanasia program arose out of a social concept, an abstract concept of what justified so-called active euthanasia. When you contrast the current contemporary active euthanasia movement, whatever your feelings about it, you come to the opposite conclusions. Number one, the current program is based on what benefits the individual. And those who are in favor of active euthanasia, the Hemlock Society, other groups, strongly emphasize the individualism, the autonomy, that it's the individual's choice. Secondly, it is voluntary. As I'll talk about in a minute, in the Netherlands, they strongly emphasize the voluntary nature of active euthanasia. Thirdly, it is done for the benefit of the individual in terms of mercy and the relief of suffering or relief of pain. And the dilemma for the Nazis and the dilemma for us today in terms of the euthanasia program, it seems to me, are diametrically the opposite. Today, one could make a case for rational suicide and active euthanasia in some circumstances, and indeed there are many circumstances, not many, but there are circumstances where it clearly would be more humane to kill than to allow to suffer and to allow nature to take its course. But the major argument against active euthanasia is not that individual case, it's the social ramifications, the social implications of such a policy. In the Nazi situation, it was just the opposite. It was always from the beginning the social value that prevailed over anything else, and it was the fact that the social value prevailed over the individual values that prevailed throughout the entire history of the Nazi euthanasia program. So I think that really the two programs in terms of the euthanasia per se are dissimilar. It is not a good analogy to compare the two together, and I think this has come out through this conference. Let me briefly discuss active euthanasia in the Netherlands for a minute, because I think it's very important to compare the two. The major point I want to make is that the social, economic, political climate in the Netherlands is so radically different in the Netherlands that you can't extrapolate what's happening there, whether successful or not, to the United States. It doesn't work. And you can't extrapolate what happened in Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945 to what's happening in the United States. First of all, in the Netherlands, the incidence of active euthanasia is not known. Some of the proponents of active euthanasia talk about 5,000, 10,000, but when you talk to these people who are well-meaning people, good people, Peter Admiral, Herbert Cohen, others, there's no systematic way of knowing how many people really have active euthanasia committed in the Netherlands at all. In fact, the registry for one recent year was only 128 were officially registered as having active euthanasia. So I think the value of 5 to 10,000 is probably way too high, and it's probably realistically more like 500, 1,000 or so. Secondly, it is widely accepted. There is no doubt that active euthanasia is widely accepted in the Netherlands. It is not legal in the sense that it is not a specific statute from the Parliament recognizing it, but recurrent Supreme Court decisions in the Netherlands, the Dutch Medical Association, the Dutch Pharmaceutical Association, all of them strongly endorse active euthanasia, and the most recent position of the Dutch Medical Association emphasized that active euthanasia should only be done by a physician and no one else. There are a set of criteria that are used in the Netherlands, which are sometimes called the Rotterdam criteria, arising from one specific court decision. But let me mention 4 or 5 of these. Now, the physicians that I talk to that are traveling around the world maintain that this is the way it's happening in the Netherlands, that there are hardly any abuses of this situation. I think for the most part they're probably correct, but I just can't conceive that any society can be that pure and that perfect as Peter Admiral and others would make it out to be. So one of the critical questions in the near future is how much abuses there are in the Netherlands of active euthanasia, and I don't think anyone really knows for sure. But some of the Rotterdam criteria, and I think some of these are very important. Number one, most importantly, that the patient must be competent, and this must be a voluntary request from the patient. And they are drawing a strong line between voluntary euthanasia and involuntary euthanasia, hoping that they'll never cross that border into involuntary euthanasia. Secondly, the request must be repeated from the patient, very clear on what the patient wanted. Thirdly, there must be intolerable suffering that is not amenable to any other form of treatment. Fourth, it must be done by a physician. And fifth, that there should be a second physician involved who's experienced in the practice of active euthanasia. The one thing that struck me 2 or 3 years ago when I was first exposed to active euthanasia in the Netherlands, and it was much more widespreadly practiced than I thought, was the fact that active euthanasia is often, extremely often, done in the concept of a very close relationship between the patient and the physician. That the patients and the physicians in the Netherlands establish a relationship over a long period of time, and that the Dutch physicians maintain that the majority of active euthanasia is done within a strong, close relationship between the patient and the physician. Obviously different than the United States. Another major factor was that there is no significant, and I believe this, there is no significant positive or negative pressure toward active euthanasia related to the legal system, unlike the United States, towards economics, at least at the present time. And the Dutch physicians again stress that this is voluntary. They feel that what we are doing in the United States is far more dangerous than what they're doing, because they stress the voluntary nature of this, and they feel that us stopping treatment on incompetent patients, vegetative and the like, for economic reasons is far more dangerous than killing per se. And I think that's one of the points that Ruth has made in terms of the most dangerous slope of all, and I would agree with her. I think that the economic slope is far more dangerous than the killing slope, although the killing slope is extremely of great concern. It's also said, and I haven't verified this, that the Netherlands has the most liberal abortion laws in the world, and they also have the lowest rate of abortions in the world. In terms of the Nazi euthanasia program, let me read you from Leo Alexander's article about the Dutch physicians. And this is from his article, Medical Science Under Dictatorship, and this is called The Example of Successful Resistance by Physicians of the Netherlands. There's no doubt that in Germany itself, the first and most effective step of propaganda within the medical profession was the propaganda barrage against the useless, incurably sick, described above. And it goes on and on and on. It says, when the Reich Commission of Occupied Netherlands territories wanted to draw the Dutch physicians into the orbit of the activities of the German medical profession, he did not tell them, you must send your chronic patients to death factories, or you must give lethal injections at government request in your offices, but he couched his order in most careful and superficially acceptable terms. And one of the paragraphs in the order of the Reich Commissar reads as follows: "It is the duty of the doctor, through advice and effort, conscientiously and to his best ability, to assist as helper the patient entrusted to his care in the maintenance, improvement, and reestablishment of his vitality, physical efficiency, and health. The accomplishment of this duty is a public task." The physicians of the Holland rejected this order unanimously because they saw what it actually meant, namely the concentration of the efforts on mere rehabilitation of the sick for useful labor and for the abolition of medical secrecy. Although on the surface the new order appeared not too grossly unacceptable, the Dutch physicians decided that it is the first, although a slight step away from the principle, that is the most important ones. The Dutch physicians declared that they would not obey this order. When the Reich Commissioner threatened them with the revocation of their licenses, they returned their licenses, removed their shingles, and while seeing their own patients secretly, no longer wrote birth or death certificates. The Reich Commissioner retraced his steps and tried to cajole them, still to no effect. Then he arrested 100 Dutch physicians and sent them to concentration camps. The medical profession remained adamant and quietly took care of their widows and orphans, but would not give in. Thus it came about that not a single euthanasia or non-therapeutic sterilization was recommended or participated in by any Dutch physician. They had the foresight to resist before the first step was taken, and they acted unanimously and won out in the end. It is obvious that if the medical profession of a small nature under the conqueror's heel could resist so effectively, the German medical profession could likewise have resisted had they not taken the fatal first step. It is the first seemingly innocent step away from principle that frequently decides a career of crime. Corrosion begins in microscopic proportions. I am not a proponent of active euthanasia. I have never done active euthanasia. I've only had one request. I feel very strongly that there should be no changes in policies towards legitimizing active euthanasia. I think there may be rare circumstances where active euthanasia may be permissible. I think the problem I have is one of the strongest arguments for physician-assisted suicide and active euthanasia is probably the strongest argument I have against the same practice. And that is in the United States, with our environment of the inhumanity of caring for patients, the concern for legalism, the economics, and so forth, the whole environment that we set up that would drive patients towards active euthanasia and could develop an argument for active euthanasia is the same environment that would give rise to the abuses, the same environment where we wouldn't have procedural safeguards to know when to minimize and when to limit active euthanasia. So for me, I have a dilemma in this area because over the years I've seen more of an argument for physician-assisted suicide, and at the same time I've seen more and more argument against physician-assisted suicide and active euthanasia in the United States. And what's happening in the Netherlands cannot be used as a lesson for what's happening here in the United States. Let me close on one other point. I think we learned from the past. I think we need to learn from the Nazi experience. And one of the critical questions is whether the Nazism was an aberration that was quantitative or qualitative, whether one of degree or one of kind. I happen to feel that it was one of degree, not one of kind. I think there are numerous examples, which I won't detail right now, of massive hypocrisy and self-deception and denial of reality in the United States at a political and socio-economic level, which I think could give rise to a lot of abuses of active euthanasia in the United States. And so I think that what happened there was a question of degree, not of kind, and I'm concerned about the abuse of the United States, and I think we have to be very careful in any endorsement of rational suicide or of active euthanasia. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all our speakers. We'll break now for a short refreshment break, so we do have plenty of time for some questions of our panelists. Thanks. I think we'll get started with discussion between the audience and the panelists. There are numerous questions of Dr. Macklin with regard to the cost issue. If cost is not a legitimate consideration in decisions of withdrawing or withholding medical care, how do you suggest that cost containment be accomplished? If providing continued medical care to a PVS patient means the hospital cannot then provide basic care to many other patients, such as not being able to open a prenatal care clinic, does cost then become a legitimate ethical consideration for withholding medical care?
Well, I'm going to say no, both for consistency and because I believe it. I think the answer to the first part of the question, what means are there or should there be for containing costs or controlling costs or making appropriate allocations, is a very large question, and people are writing whole big books about it, and it's really beyond the scope of our conference today. I was essentially arguing two somewhat different but smaller points. First, to use cost at the bedside as a means of rationing, particularly when pressured by hospital administrators, when the physician is unwilling to remove life supports, when patients have not requested it and families are opposed to it. My point was this has much greater similarities with the Nazi euthanasia program than people might at first think. That was really my first point, and I argue against bedside rationing. The question of how society might best do some rationing or allocation schemes is a much bigger question, and I would start by asking about the appropriateness of mounting high technology programs that in the nature of the case are going to benefit very few people or are going to require agonizing selections. One example of a failed program, one that probably should not have gotten started and maybe we can learn a lesson from it, is the artificial heart program. That was a great amount of money and a very foolish use of society's resources for a high technology program that actually served very few, and even if it had been more successful in providing a decent quality of life and prolonging life, still would have served very few people. I agree entirely with the supposition of the question that what is needed is more prevention, more prenatal care. I doubt very much that that pie is exactly divided up in that way, given the multiple funding and sources. So I'd like to see the answer too, but my own answer is not at the bedside by hospital administrators who say, let's pull the plugs on these comatose patients.
This question's for Dr. Sattelman. I applaud your efforts to point out the inexcusable citing of Drs. Rudin and von Verschuur in contemporary research papers without reference to their evil pasts. I do, however, challenge your comment that twin research is immutably linked with the names of those men and with the name of Mengele. Many researchers today are actively and selflessly engaged in twin studies to foster the well-being of twins and non-twins, and do so with adherence to the highest of ethical standards. Please comment.
Okay. I did not intend in my comments to taint, so to speak, people who are legitimately involved in such work. What I am trying to point out is the dichotomy that exists in science today, and particularly in genetics and psychiatry, in that people who had respectable careers in Germany, who were considered legitimate, were professors, and had a major influence in terms of Nazi medicine, continue to be cited and have become part of our own legacy. So it's merely to point out the dichotomy that exists and the fact that medicine is not fallible and that these influences affect us in different ways. I don't mean to suggest that all geneticists are in fact tainted by it, nor do I mean to suggest that people engaged in twin research are tainted by the work of Verschuur and Mengele. But I do think we have to be mindful of the linkages and the risks that science has to face in terms of whatever work or research we're involved in that involves this type of work. Nothing is pure. Science is not without values, and that we have to look at these various relationships, some of which are peripheral but still affect us all.
Question for Rabbi Wise. Please clarify the relationship between Kiddush Hashem to the death of the Jewish victims in the Holocaust.
I really can't answer that. I cannot clarify it. I can only say that that's one of the areas where, especially for one who not only himself did not experience the Shoah, but whose immediate family did not, that where silence is the appropriate response. I would say that there is both a theoretical and a halachic debate as to what Kiddush Hashem is, and I must emphasize, because reality being what it is historically, that most people, when they hear that term and know it, the Hebrew from the word kadosh, holy, as in Isaiah, kadosh, 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 holy, 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 think of martyrdom, and that is not the only alternative in regard to participating in the sanctifying of God's presence here on earth, which is basically what it is. One ideally can live a long, healthy life doing it every day. Tragically, the term has become almost synonymous with dying, and I think that's a very poignant commentary. The debate revolves around some similar phrasing here, voluntary and involuntary. Does one have to consciously, by existential choice, give up one's life for a higher purpose to qualify, or is there another variation in death, such as with victims during the Crusades, which is where a lot of the debate first surfaced in the 11th and 12th centuries. So I would not venture beyond the boundary which I have set for myself to make any statement that would or could be interpreted as my authoritative position, rejected or accepted, on whether the victims who died at the Holocaust were participating in Kiddush Hashem, not to also preclude that from being the case. I think the Holocaust, to many, and again there's an argument about this, is for me is so big and convoluted and complex that I had to draw a few boundaries, and I would have to cross over one to directly answer that question.
For Dr. Cranford, given our aging population, the cost of health care, and the susceptibility of many elderly persons to the idea that they are a burden when no longer productive, there would seem to be in many cases the strong possibility for an internalized pressure to request assisted suicide. Did your panel of physicians discuss this issue before endorsing physician-assisted suicide?
Yes, we did discuss that, and I think that was one of the major concerns we had about taking the position we did, that in the future that there may be more pressure put on individuals to be less of a burden to themselves and to others. I think it's happening right now. You see a lot of situations where the elderly are admitted to hospital institutionalized, where it does cost a great deal of money for the patient or the family, and there's already pressures being put on people, and this subtle, insidious pressure that we don't admit up front is the kind of pressure that I'm concerned about. But yes, that was a major factor, and I think it's another major reason why we should be extremely cautious about approving of rational suicide or of active euthanasia. But I think there are widespread abuses of the program now with stopping treatment. I think I'm more concerned about the abuses right now of the economic rationale of stopping treatment than I am concerned about active killing in the future. So I think we have to look at the abuses we're doing right now, and that's just one of many.
I take it this question is addressed to the panel as a whole. The primacy of personhood is a philosophical and/or spiritual value that is not part of some political ideologies. If primacy of personhood is core to bioethics, does this suggest that there is a separate ethic in socialism and communism? Or does it suggest that socialism and communism are intrinsically unethical? Or do you have a different suggestion?
Well, it's a philosophical question, isn't it? I'm not exactly sure if the writer of the question might possibly be confusing the concept of individualism, which is central to, as usually described politically and economically, a capitalistic system, Western democratic capitalism, individualism rather than personhood. The term personhood comes into the field of bioethics in a lot of different contexts that make no distinctions between capitalism, communism, and socialism. The term personhood is usually understood and debated in the bioethics literature and among bioethicists is when there is a person, when a person exists. As everyone knows, that question has been debated about fetal life, but it's also debated and discussed when people have lost capacity, when individuals become severely demented or eventually lose their mental capacity entirely and are in persistent vegetative state or comatose. Those are the areas in which the questions of personhood arise, or the primacy of personhood, and once again, those don't make any distinctions among different political systems. So I think we'd have to see if the question is intending to ask whether different social, political, economic schemes treat the individual differently, and that may or may not be so. That requires a comparative study in biomedical ethics across cultures. But I think it's a different question from the notion of the primacy of personhood.
I won't respond to the issue of personhood as such, but Robert Proctor in his book presents an intriguing analysis in terms of differentiating between fascism and communism, in terms from a scientific perspective, in that fascism embraced genetics and eugenics in terms of that there was an inherent predetermination in terms of various human traits, whereas the socialist perspective or communist perspective was that of environment. It wasn't inherent, but it was based on the environment. And that was the early part of his book, and represents, I think, a fascinating concept for further comparison and study. The other is, it was some months ago now, and I forget the actual details, but saw the, and I regret that the other member of the panel couldn't make it from the Soviet Union for whatever reason, but the medical oath of the Soviet Union in many respects incorporates the concept of Weltanschauung in terms of one pays loyalty to the state and not to the individual. And I think that would be worthy of further study as well.
I would only add that I hear the issue more as between, not so much the personhood again, as without a unique identity, as much as the variable being in recognizing that each individual is unique in what particular, in different societies, where does the importance of the individual vis-a-vis the society come down? And there are different value systems which help determine that. In the Jewish system, there's a very important dialectic between the community and the individual. That an individual cannot exist independent of the community, it must contribute to the community, and the community also, if it is to be vibrant and vital, needs to respect the individuality of each of its members. So I would doubt that within a socialistic or communistic country that we would find them denying that each individual is a unique entity. What we may differ on is when and how much one sacrifices one's individual agenda toward the better goal of the society. And that where we fall in regard to that question is perhaps the issue here.
All right. For Dr. Seidelman, did I understand you to say that the specimens, hunchbacked and club-footed and all manner of what they collected to show the abnormalities of the Jewish race, are still in existence and still being used for study? And second question, what more precisely would you have physicians in the U.S. and Canada do in order to recognize their Nazi medicine heritage?
Well, I'll answer the last part first, or try to answer the last part first. And I think that Arthur Kaplan alluded to that yesterday when he said that in looking at bioethics today, that there's no reference made really to the Nazi period. And I think basically it requires a sensitization on the part of the medical profession to an important aspect of their history. And I think that that sort of thing needs to be emphasized. And as I mentioned, that we acknowledge the nobles in terms of our tradition, and yet we ignore evil. A medical school is filled with icons of its heroes, be it Hippocrates, Lister, John Hunter the surgeon, Sir William Osler, or what have you. But we really haven't recognized the fallibility of medicine. And I think it's important that if we're going to establish an ethical base, we look at the fallibility of medicine and we look at this well-documented example of evil that unfortunately we ignore. Going on to the first part of the question, which is related to the first part, which is related to the second, as I mentioned at the outset of my paper, that it's Benno Muller-Hill has really been the chronicler, and I basically provide commentary. And Benno was the person who was largely responsible for the identification and reporting of the fact that some anatomical specimens were still maintained by some of the German medical schools. My knowledge is based on what he has told me and what has been featured in news reports, the Jerusalem Post, Time Magazine in Canada, and the local Toronto newspaper, as well as Nature Magazine, that in two German universities, Tübingen and Heidelberg, specimens have been identified, which documentation shows were obtained from people killed by the Nazis during that period of time. In Tübingen it was histology specimens, and also there have been the heads of people who were executed, which have or decapitated, which have been preserved. I think that that's just may in fact be just the beginning, and it's created a great deal of consternation among some people, but I think in terms of further details on that as to what it is, I think that Benno is probably the best person to respond in detail to that.
Dr. Cranford, why do you see AIDS as in any way raising different issues for physician-assisted suicide?
Because AIDS is a classic terminal disease where the patient will almost invariably die, where there's a great deal of suffering associated with AIDS, and not only suffering associated with AIDS, but certain parts of that which are not refractory to treatment. It's not just a question of pain, it's a question of diarrhea, it's a question of recurrent pneumocystis infections with recurrent respiratory distress and intubation, respiratory assistance. It's a question of ulcerations of the mouth and tongue, and there are so many aspects of AIDS that makes it a very unique disease in terms of being a horribly painful, uncomfortable, dying disease where all the symptoms cannot be treated. It is a very unique disease. There are other conditions in terms of cancer of the mouth and the tongue, other cancers that other people may know about, where it's very difficult to treat it in dying phases, but a lot of cancer can be treated. It's not being treated by the most American physicians, but 95% of most of the symptoms of most cancer patients can be treated adequately under ideal circumstance, like in a hospice setting, but it's not. But that is not true of AIDS, and you cannot treat all the symptoms, unfortunately, of AIDS with treatment short of putting them into a coma, which is a pretty fine line between that and active euthanasia. So it is a unique disease. Not only is AIDS that, but AIDS has created a lot of different approaches to a lot of different areas of public health, a lot of different areas. It's a unique disease which has really challenged us in a lot of different ways and will continue to challenge us.
Rabbi Weiss, considering the content of your speech, it seems more appropriate that you compare your definition of metaphysics to theology instead of to ethics. Perhaps you could elucidate on the comparison you intended.
I think some of these distinctions are recent. I tried to point to the fact that in medieval philosophical and theological circles, ethics was a part of those dialogues and discussions. To sort of center the debate here on ethics so that it would not be seen in a vacuum, and that the issues we deal with here, whether we employ actively theological terminology or even philosophical terminology, that we see that the whole question of ethics is born out of not just an existential, but out of a societal or collective struggle with trying to determine what is right to do and what is not right to do. And I personally find that
when I was planning this meeting, and some of you may now be thinking, did anybody really plan this meeting? But I did. And I will tell you that I picked every speaker intentionally. I put the order together with intent. I talked about it with the advisory committee and others, but there was a plan, and it's unfolded in somewhat the way I thought it would. But there was something about this topic that made me feel that we should end the meeting by listening to people who had some sort of association with the events of the Holocaust, some who would speak as survivors of experiments, some who would speak as survivors of camps, some who might have been at the trial, and so, or some who might have fought the Nazis. And so I did something that doesn't happen so much at academic conferences. I decided we would end with a panel discussion of people who had these sorts of relationships. You note that all through the conference we've been passing up questions to the front. Now there's a mic. You can still pass questions up to the front if you've gotten in the habit, but you could also go to the mic at the end of this. Some people have said we're running behind. That's true, and I'm prepared to stay as long as people want to keep going to the mic, I guess. I did not open the floor. We talked about whether we should have it open or not, because I did not want the atmosphere that I think appropriate to the subject to be jeopardized. And I think the decision in terms of the quality of questions and how the discourse has been appropriate. But the time has come to stop that mode of discourse and to open the floor for those who might want to say something, so we'll do that. I'm also going to do something a little different for this last session. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves to you. I don't want to prejudge how they might want to identify themselves or say even why they think I asked them to serve on this. Some of them probably can remember, some of them probably don't remember anymore, but in any event, I'll let them tell you who they are. Some you've met already, some you haven't. And I've asked them to speak for 10 minutes, although Dr. Berger has a longer period of time because he has tried to prepare something that he felt he could not adequately address last evening, the specifics of the adequacy, validity, utility of the hypothermia data, and I've agreed to let him do it. I think, in the interests of time, in addition to letting each of the panelists say who they are, I'll try and let them look to their hearts as to how long they want to speak. That must be the toughest moral assignment of the whole conference. And then after we have that done, as I said, we'll go to the open mic. I simply want to take advantage of my having the chair to say two things. And I've thought a little bit about what I said at the beginning of this meeting and why it was held. You know, when I wrote about the question of using Nazi data, about a year ago I talked a lot in some newspaper columns and some statements about the need to see ghosts, ghosts of innocent people who were killed, and to see murderers wearing white coats with their certificates and licenses hanging, as Bill Seidelman said, to greet people coming onto the ramps. I want to say one word about what the conference has meant to me in terms of ghosts. You know, ghosts are very hard to see, and they are very hard to identify, and they're very difficult to wrestle with if you don't know where they are. But there are lots of ghosts at our conference. Eugen Fischer's been here. Herman Siemens came. Joseph Mengele came with his stick on his boot. Ernst Ruden came, almost got away, but he arrived. The doctors on the ramps came. Karl Brandt is here. Fritz Lenz, members of the Nazi Physicians League, Himmler, Hitler, Ottmar von Verscher, Sigmund Rascher's been here, Robert Ritter. Some other ghosts have been here. The women of Ravensbrück, the children stabbed with needles of phenol in the heart, some innocent persons tortured in the decompression chambers, and hypothermia vats have come. These helplessly mentally ill people and handicapped people have attended. The Jews and gypsies and POWs, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, people who were shot and gassed. They've been here. And I feel now we have finally defeated the trick that Nazi medicine and science have played on us. The issues of whether we use the data, is it appropriate to use the Holocaust with reference to abortion and so forth. I don't agree with much that's been said about those things. But for me, that's not the point. The point is that we now have the ghosts. We taped them, we talked about them, we audio recorded them, and hopefully we'll get them in a book. And so they'll be here. And whatever you want to say, and whatever the panel chooses to say, we found these ghosts. They came, we now have them. And so we trapped the ghosts. It is a long time that medicine and science have escaped. It's been a long time since the influence of Nazi medicine and science on our science and medicine has been grappled with. But you see, it won't be possible any longer to escape the ghosts, because we now have them. We have not resurrected them totally, but we have faint images. And so that, to me, is the achievement of the conference. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Susan first, and then I think we'll go to Gisela, Charles Carroll, and then Bob Berger.
As the conference has progressed, I've been of the increasing impression that many speakers, and again, it's an impression, have insufficient knowledge of the topic of the Holocaust, and possibly for that reason are continuously circling around the actual topic relating to related topics such as euthanasia, abortion, etc. A topic that is so huge and so complex and so difficult to understand as Holocaust itself needs no synonyms. It needs no related topics. It needs to be dealt. If dealt with at all, it needs to be dealt with head on. So, I am presenting a return to the matter at hand, Holocaust and bioethics. First, my credibility. Someone yesterday made the statement that I am at a disadvantage. That my disadvantage is because I was there. I was in Birkenau. I was a victim of human experimentation. And so, by having been a victim of human experimentation, of course, I have emotional reactions to the idea of the use of the data. To some degree, this offends me. It's saying that I'm crippled by emotions, that I can't think rationally, and I am literally led by feelings and not mind. Yes, when I talk about Birkenau, when I talk about Dr. Joseph Mengele, I'm not talking about something I read in a book. It isn't a paragraph or pages in a book that come to mind. The picture of a man comes to mind. A memory of a direct relationship comes to mind. Real pictures come to mind. But since when is the experience of life not real education? It seems as though as far back as the Greeks, the experience has always been the best education. Also, though, in addition to that, I have studied academically. I have searched and searched and searched. I haven't found an answer, but I have found a better understanding of the human condition through my academic studies. I was born Sarah Seiler, today married, changed my name when I came to this country, and I'm Susan Vigorito, one of two twins trapped in Joseph Mengele's block for a year. I survived. Hannah didn't, by quirk of circumstance, since the Russians were at the gate of Auschwitz the day she died. I'd like to describe the personality of this doctor that I had so much to do with. And those of you who are doctors and scientists, maybe you can take from this description of what he was like and ask yourself, what parts of this description is like me and what is not? And thereby learn what not to become. Above all, Dr. Joseph Mengele was not a monster. He was not someone that you would immediately recognize as the Nazi madman a mile away. Some adult survivors, people who were adults in the camp, more prone to look at physique, said he was a rather handsome man. He was medium-sized, maybe around 5'8", very dark hair, deep-set eyes, rather pleasant to look at, as if you were referring to, was he handsome? From a child's point of view, he was frightful to look at because he had a certain something in his eyes. Some philosophers say that the eyes are the mirrors of the human soul. It's not exactly a nothing type statement. Sure, all of you have experienced when looking into a person's eyes, you can get an idea, is that person troubled about something? Is that person happy? Is the person cold? Is the person kind? Is he cruel? Is he outgoing? Some things are more readily recognizable. The utter coldness and cruelty was reflected in this man's eyes. But this man was not always the cold-blooded scientist, if I might say. And with that, I don't mean that all scientists are cold-blooded. I am saying that Dr. Mengele was cold-blooded. In one part of him, Dr. Mengele was like two people, but he was not a split personality. He was able to divide himself into two different types of people. When he was operating as the scientist, he was particular, very particular about his data, very particular about his specimens. Things had to be done a certain way. Things had to be conducted a certain way. Even to the point Dr. Mengele had to be addressed a certain way. We were instructed how he must be addressed, and there was to be no deviance from the method. It was Herr Doktor, nothing else. Herr Doktor, not hey, or no introduction at all. It was Herr Doktor. Serious consequence would follow for any deviation. He was indeed very exact. When conducting an experiment, Dr. Mengele was the utmost detached, disassociated type of person. I disagree with Reverend Neuhaus that the Nazi doctors depersonalized themselves. Depersonalization means becoming not a person. If person means Mensch, okay, then I agree with you, but I don't quite understand the word person as meaning the same thing as Menschlichkeit, the philosophical term of what really it means to be human. But what the Nazi doctors did do is detach themselves from the real meaning of being human. They were born like you. They were born like me. They were at one time young boys who went to Hitler youth camps, who were taught with repeated and repeated and repeated exercises how not to react to pain. It was considered heroic not to react to pain. Awards were given for acts of bravery which consisted of not reacting to pain, not reacting the Menschlich way. And so the training came early. Those who graduated became Nazis and became proficient at being able to detach themselves from the reality facing them. But Dr. Mengele at time also was not the hard-hearted scientist. At times, he came, for example, into his laboratory. My sister and I were kept in his private laboratory, by the way, which was located in Crematoria 2. And we were kept in a cage, a wooden cage, with a wooden floor, slats on all four sides, and a lid at the top. About 1.5 yards square. That was our home for 1.5 years. Well, he sometimes came into his laboratory, true, with an ulterior motive, but he demonstrated the ability to be quite different. He would take one of us out, or both of us, and with a rather very gentle voice, a very gentle mode, would talk with us, almost like a father. I remember times he took me upon his lap, and he talked with me, like a mensch, like as if he had real feelings for humanity. And he would put us back. But then in the afternoon, the same person, the same face, the same hair, the same body, the same person would come back, take us out, put us on the experiment table without any expressing any feeling. He would do his cold job. When he came like that, then he became the absolute cold, detached scientist. And I became no longer a she or a twin. I became the special material, the Spezialmaterial. as he referred to Dr. Nitzli, the pathologist who worked for him. I became an it. And by making me an it, which produced data, he himself was able to better perform the outrageous torture which was so characteristic of him. But to visualize Dr. Mengele as a monster is most incorrect and is very dangerous. Because if we visualize Hitler, the Nazis as monsters, we will never recognize the monsters in our midst. They look like us. Science, if restricted to a sterile practice, a practice which is careful in all modes to use the most sterile of words. Words experiment, what a clean word. It sounds very sterile and clean. Words of uninformed consent, a very clean word. And somehow I cannot associate those words with Birkenau. Experiment needs to be defined. I've sent a question card up 5 times requesting scientists to define experiment. Unfortunately, I've never had them answer it, never got to it. I feel when dealing with experiment in our understanding, we should first define our understanding of experiment. What are its parameters? What are its extensions? In order to understand whether Auschwitz fits those definitions. We think of experiment, we think of trying to prove or disprove a fact, and that's all we think of. We don't think of children, I mean little children. Might I tell you how old I was? I was 3.5 when I became Dr. Mengele's victim. I was 4.5 when I was liberated. He didn't hesitate for age, but he was only able to do this not because he didn't know ethics. And please forgive me if you feel that I'm being presumptuous. The Nazi Germans knew ethics. It was a matter of detachment, a matter of disassociating oneself from what was before you. It was for this precise reason that the initial method of murdering Jews as they lined up along the trenches didn't work. It was because inside of the gut of the human being is a feeling of right and wrong. And even the Nazi, as well trained as they were, could not overcome the ultimate gut sense of right and wrong. And so the disassociating method began. It ended up where Jews were feeding Jews into oven. Jews were putting Jews into the gas chambers. The pathologist at the right hand of Dr. Mengele was a Jew forced to be in this position. Much of the so-called horrible work were done by prisoners. Again, the sterile word prisoner. Prisoner, as I said yesterday, is a sterile word. But prisoner in the Nazi era was not commonly a criminal. The very, very great minority might have been criminals. But the definite majority were people who were simply born Jewish, Gypsy, or who had the courage to disapprove of the Nazi regime. We became it. We were not she. Eva was here yesterday. Most of you probably noticed her number on her arm. This was the method. of becoming it. I too have a number. When the number was put upon our arm, the name disappeared. We were in different barracks. I was in his laboratory. Only one other twin survived his lab. And Eva was in a barrack with girls, and the boys were separated. But the number is what made us an it. It thingified us, so to say. And by making us no longer a she, a he, or a them, it's much easier to manipulate the thing or the it. It's like we became a lab specimen. The literature of the Holocaust, and certainly there is much written about the Holocaust, and indeed it should be. But there are also mistakes written, and these need to be corrected. The other day I was on my way upstairs to my room on the elevator. Another woman in the elevator was standing in the elevator, clutched under her arm with a book by Robert Lifton, Nazi Doctors. I approached the woman and I said, "Ma'am, can I tell you something about your book?" Briskly, the woman turned around and said, "I've read the book." I assumed she did. However, the book is not it. It is not the alpha and omega. It is paper. And today we have among us, yet, and for maybe 30 some more years, people who were eyewitnesses. Authors, and Robert Lifton has acknowledged, make mistakes. Proceeded to try to tell the woman, the chapter on Dr. Mengele has a serious error in it. And I have researched, I have called, I have written to the survivors. And there aren't really that many. There's not that much writing. There's 110 of us that we have contacted who are survivors. No one ever saw a mattress or a sheet or white bread. And yet Robert Lifton defines Dr. Mengele's research victims in this way, that we had it better. As I told you, I was in a cage. And the cage had no mattress in it. I never saw a sheet. This is important. Robert Lifton is a good author. An author is always, there's no crime in making a mistake. If the author is not willing to correct it, then there is a problem. However, he is more than willing to put out a revised version of his book. The Orthodox confrontation of the Holocaust. I belong to the Orthodox community of Judaism. That's foremost important for what I'm about to say. But it's imperative also that Orthodoxy and Judaism make up its mind to confront the Holocaust. It's shameful that this section of Judaism has, up to this point, walked circles and circles and circles around the Holocaust. Even having the courage to tell a survivor that the reason for the Holocaust is God's anger at the sinfulness of the Jews. I have had it said to me, I don't know how many times. And if indeed that were so, I would be an atheist today, because my God does not take his anger out on innocent children. Orthodox rabbis, to this point, and I say this only because there have been quotations from rabbis, are not really equipped to give an opinion for the result of this particular debate. They have not studied the actual meaning of the Holocaust sufficiently, and they have not faced it directly enough to be able to answer whether or not the data from the experiments in the Holocaust should be used. First, you have to face the absolute evil of the Holocaust, and you have to be willing to admit it. But also you have to be able to admit to yourself that such an evil is the result of man. What is the data anyway? Much of it, at least we have been talking about hypothermia. We've been talking about phosgene gas experiments. These have been revealed, copied over. We know what it is. Scientists have access to it right and left. And I agree with Dr. Kaplan to say, now put the lid on the data for the phosgene experiments and put the lid on the data of the hypothermia experiments when everything has been exposed is useless. Even if the lid were to stay on as long as I'm alive, I'm one of the youngest. In fact, I believe I am the youngest survivor of the Holocaust. I am certain after I pass away, it would be used. So it's fruitless. The most that we can do here is put the lid on the data that has not been opened, and there's plenty of it. Again, what is the data? Data. Another it. What is this data? This data is human beings. It is bloody. Believe me, it is bloody. I have seen the blood. You would shiver. And Dr. Pozos, if you are here, you would shiver if you would see the amount of blood that is involved in this data and the utter cruelty that is involved in this data. I'm not being emotional. I'm being factual. My father saw in Dachau a child ripped in half, with the Nazi standing on each side of the child having hold of a leg and an arm. As I told you, my sister died of repeated injections into her spinal column until finally it killed her. I didn't have a leg to walk on until I was 14, 15 years old because of the continuous scrapings of my bone tissue. No anesthetic, nothing for pain, no empathy. The cold scientist, as compared to the man who also went home to his children and was a father, a husband, and a wife. One has to be careful that the data is not God. We cannot divinize the data. It isn't everything. Really, our science today, modern, in the age of modernity, technology, is so sophisticated. We're on the verge, at least we can already lengthen the life of an AIDS victim. Who says we will not have the cure for AIDS? We found the cure for smallpox. We found the cure for polio. We have found the cure for numerous diseases. Why do we have to stoop to the loneliness of Birkenau, to the loneliness of the Nazi data? I will never have respect for science if science stoops to that low level. Because science then becomes nothing but a sham. My final comments is, remember, compare yourself with the Nazi scientists. Have you had moments when, in order to accomplish something that you have put higher than it maybe should be, something that you have almost made into a god, that you have numbed the mensch in you, or put the mensch aside so that you can accomplish the task? Probably in minor elements, we've all done that in a little bit. This is important. This was the Nazi doctor, the person that was able to make himself into a machine and carry out the task. It was the person who was superior in the act of obedience, the ultimately obedient person. In fact, this was the answer at Nuremberg. At Nuremberg it was ruled and finalized that the data from the Nazi doctors could not be used. No person in medical or scientific research now or at any time in the future should ever be able to see any gain from the human torture used by the Nazi doctor, lest he be tempted to repeat it. This conference has been an issue over the confrontation of evil and the value of life. Let me answer a few questions. Millions of lives have been stolen. For children, 1,600,000. And the data obtained from the murderous human, often a small child, could save a human life. This is extremely presumptuous, since Nazi doctors were affected by anger. There were times Dr. Mengele came into the laboratory and he was angry. I had no idea why he was angry, but he was angry. And his anger perpetrated an instant experiment. Or he was angry at me, or he was angry at my sister, and so it perpetrated a repetition of experiment. One time he was angry, and I had 4 fingers of my right hand smashed. There was empathy. The Jewish scientist, Dr. Nutzli, the pathologist, received a body at one time, was asked to examine it, and he labeled it other than typhoid, even though the body was typhoid, in order to save the whole barrack of people that would have been sent to the ovens otherwise. There were time limits. Sometimes there wasn't enough time. And Mengele was impatient. As in his impatience, constantly created pressure for his assistants. Hurry up, mach schnell. This has to be done. These were all things that affected the experiments. One cannot put the value of one human life over another without becoming a partner in the Nazi crime. The end does not justify the means. So something good is done with the data. At least the victims will have died for a purpose. No, the purpose cannot be changed without engaging in revisionism. It is genocide, it is torture, it is absolute evil. Only in an effort to deny the reality of the Holocaust's evil can this statement be made. The data is there, so we must use it. No. Science must not become the master of man. Human manipulation in the form of torture must not stir the human curiosity of man. A mistake made must not be repeated. Moral overconfidence in our superiority over them, the Nazis, is a dangerous enemy. Are we so different only 44 years later? We will become like them. We are made of the same stuff. And one more thing. If you have a loaded gun laying on the table, must you use it? In conclusion to my talk, I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to ask only one favor, is that I receive the proper credit for the fact that I had, for at least 365 days, if not more, a direct relationship with Dr. Joseph Mengele. He was one of the leading Nazi doctors, and I hope I've made it clear what his personality is like. And the biggest danger really here is the scientist who becomes the sterile scientist, the machine who no longer is a mensch. Scientist has to include ethics. Without adding ethics to its very method, it does become, the scientist does become another Dr. Mengele. Thank you very much.
I want to first thank Susan, because she has really put the ghosts in the right place. And I have to say, I too was very offended by somebody saying that the victims and the perpetrators both were depersonalized. It scared me to think that way, because the perpetrators went home and were fathers and had a good time. They were not depersonalized. But I will speak from not a different, but just another angle of that experience. I was older than Susan. She was a child. When the Nazis came to power, I was 23 years old. And from that, and that's in 1933, 6 years before the Holocaust. But from the very first minute on, and in fact just before they came to power, I myself and many others decided that we would not be victims only, but that we would be active resistors. I think it's very important to remember that. I am a Jew, so I'm in that sense a victim. But in the other sense, I feel it was right that together with many others, Jews and non-Jews, inside Germany, later in Austria, later in France, we were actively resisting the Nazis. I think, as far as I can see, it's only Benno Hill who really understood that there were people who were persecuted because of their convictions also. And that to me is very important. I spent a short time in a concentration camp. I did spend time in prison, but I have to say that nothing can compare with what Susan experienced, so I have seen horrors and experienced them myself. But I want to relate to the subject of the conference because she did best in putting the ghosts right before us. First, I want to make it very clear that the Nazi persecution started by 1933, that people were immediately restricted and there were immediately professors dismissed, and that there was anybody who disagreed with the Nazis thinking or was denounced for that was imprisoned. And all that stories about we didn't know are nonsense. Everybody knew about it. In 1950 and 51, I was sent by the American government back to Germany because it was concerned what happened to the children. And at that time when people said to me, well, we didn't know, I have to tell you, I almost laughed because I said, oh, were you afraid? And yes, we were afraid. Well, then you did know what happened. Maybe not the details, but you did know. I think it must be very clear that the Nazi persecution was one of the worst racial persecutions. It was racism in its worst form and was based on two premises that are always the base of racism. That there is a race somewhere in this world that is superior to all others. And in this case, the Nazis said it was a Germanic one, but other people are using it. That anyone who disagreed with that idea became immediately also part of the inferior race. And from those two premises, according to the Nazis, it followed naturally that all these inferior people not only had to be destroyed, that would have been one thing, but just because of their hate and because of their innate sadism, and especially in the medical experiences, that killing was not enough. And I have over and over, when I have talked to people about the horror years that I have experienced, that it wasn't only the killing. We always talk about the 6 million dead, that's horrible. But it was the torture and the demeaning that was added. hate turned into you are nothing but a bug. Just what Susan described in a much better way than I can do it. So let us make one thing very clear, and that is that the experiments, and I like the idea to finally define that word, but they were no experiments, and they were not scientific undertakings. They were sadistic attacks disguised as science. I want to underline that. Almost all the medical so-called experiments, including those of freezing people to death, were done with or without anesthetics. In no way, certainly, would that have made the whole thing more acceptable. But that's an additional indication that this was no scientific undertaking. And in other experiments, and we sometimes don't talk about those, but why was there such an enormous emphasis on this so-called scientific experiments always related to the genitalia? It's very strong there. Now, do we remember that all theories of racial hatred always include preoccupation with sex? They always imply that members of the so-called inferior race need to be feared because they intend to rape the so-called beautiful superior race. That's what they want to do. Some of you may have forgotten that the early Nazi laws forbade women under 45 years to serve as maids or whatever in a Jewish household that included a male member. That was based on this incredible, nonsensical, racial nonsense. To the Nazis very clearly, anybody who either disagreed or was a Jew or a gypsy or a Pole were just not persons. I'm shocked that some people, I'm afraid it was Neuhaus, talks about something like good intentions, that they are somehow, he compared Holocaust with the other things, that with good intentions, this whole business of folk and social hygiene ideologies were absolutely screens and falsehood, and everybody who has lived through that period knew that. But certainly in the newspapers, that's what you had to feed people. All for the folk was not an ideology. It was simply a rationalization of very sadistic racial impulses. I remember myself that when one of these doctors had to inoculate us, I will say that very shortly, and he took the same syringe over and over to the same person. Somebody else mentioned that, this was not yet in the concentration camp, mentioned that to him, and he said in my presence, for those who cares, they are not persons, it doesn't matter. In the concentration camp, I saw a man hunted to death, not shot, hunted to death by making him run and then fall down and then get up.
Sigmund Rascher graduated from medical school in 1935-1936.
If we want to look at that.
The actual
and by the way,
circumstances of his graduation are somewhat in question.
To use these data about hypothermia. I have to tell you that first of all, I'm sure they are not valid in many ways because it was done with people.
He was at one time suspected of communist sympathies, was barred from the University of Munich, and this may have something to do with his motivation. He had to really get back into the graces of the Third Reich.
When you drink alcohol and lie down
Then he
in the
meets
snow,
this
that you
woman.
die.
Her name is Nina
Think of this
Dio.
great
She's
experiment
15
that
years
now
older than he
proves
is.
that you mustn't take alcohol
And
when
for
you
some
are
odd reason, and there are all kinds of stories
ridiculous. I
about
knew
it, I
that
don't
when I
know
was
what the
13.
truth is, but the high SS
I must
officials
say that I find
described
it
her
inexcusable to
that she was
dignify
viewed by
murderers
Himmler as
with the word
persona
scientist.
gratissima.
or dignified what they
direct
did
quotation.
with the word research.
And these two guys, Himmler,
Research
we know a little
with
bit about in
people.
Russia,
These are people.
are the
Must
backbone
recognize the human
of
being
not only
as
the
valuable.
Dachau experiments, but
I
Himmler
hope
is obviously
that we
behind many other
expect
things.
consent,
Now, Leo
even if we
Alexander
give somebody
found a
placebos.
huge,
We haven't done it always, but we should.
volume of correspondence
I
between
think
Russia and Himmler.
It once
It's
more,
amazing
I
that
repeat,
here is
it
a
was
lowly
torture and degradation.
medical officer in
and
the
not,
army.
quote,
Himmler is probably the
scientific
second most
experiment.
powerful man in the
Wasn't
Third
even
Reich,
cool science.
and they have a personal
Now,
communication.
I know there
personal
should be many
correspondence.
answers
So
that I
this
should
guy
give to
Rasher,
the
whatever he
questions
does,
that Arthur
is not a
Kaplan raised,
simple
but I can't.
army
But that was
Luftwaffe
the
captain in the
beginning
medical
of one
corps.
definitely
The
no
correspondence is
dignity,
personal in
absolutely
tone.
no dignity.
The subject
Should be afforded
is
to the
chiseling, and
data
chiseling is
and
Dr.
those who
Alexander's
produce
word. That's
them.
why I put in quotation.
I find it
That's
even
not my word.
scary to
For
think that the
personal
names
funds,
should be
he wants
preserved.
160
For what?
marks, 200
I
marks.
find it
He wants his
wonderful if they are
statue dues.
thrown to the
He
wind
wants food
and
supplements for
forgotten.
his kids.
Not what they did.
He asked for furniture,
But their names.
slave servants.
No.
He also asked for an apartment.
And no
and interestingly,
torture ever
Himmler responds to all
permits
those
anyone
positively. The only thing he didn't get
save
was a new
somebody
apartment
else's
because
life.
Munich
It's
was bombed
torture
down
that
at the
was
time.
done. I think we can make our own
Some other
discoveries
things in
without offending humanity.
this correspondence.
I want to
Denunciation
add
of
a
free
little
people. The
other
Russians
thinking.
go
I'm
to a
watching
small
time
town,
carefully.
spend 2 weeks in
to
a
what we have
in a
learned
guest
with
inn.
many other things
They
about the
write a letter
Holocaust.
to Himmler that
We
the
always
owner
have
of
to
the inn
remember a
doesn't
very
use German
basic
greetings,
principle.
he's not patriotic enough, so on and
Science,
so on.
technology
The letter is dated
are
July
valueless.
24th.
In
The guest
itself,
house is raided by
they
the
don't
SS
have
July
any value.
27th.
But
There's
the
a great deal of
use
professional
of them
intrigue.
in a world
Russia
habitated
is
by
not
people,
liked by his
human
medical army
ethics and
superiors.
values must
They,
enter.
I don't know
We
what
finally
exactly the
can
reason
get
is.
that
He's not
clear.
respected. There are problems.
For
But
instance,
somehow,
Proctor and I think
Russia
some
uses
others
Himmler to
speak
protect
as
himself.
of
And some of these
physicians, as
intrigues
scientists.
actually, it
Well,
was fun
most
to read
physicians
some
are
of these
not.
things.
They are a
not quite
wonderful
Hollywood,
profession that
quite
builds
interesting.
part of knowledge
As far as
of
human
science
research in the
and part
correspondence,
of
you
experience
get the proposals,
and finally part on very
they
good
discuss
judgment, hopefully.
scientific and administrative matters
I
in
know
great
that
detail.
nowadays, and I
Himmler has to
find that
approve
very
the
good,
project.
that
So
when
it's
we
a
as
strange
patients
kind of
are
a
prepared for
correspondence.
surgery, we sign a statement that includes the acknowledgement
Well, I
that
can go
medicine
on.
is
He's
not an exact
manipulative,
science.
dishonest,
I have to
domineering,
smile
ruthless,
because I'm kind
and
of
I can
pleased
back
that they
all
finally
this
put
up.
that
This
in.
is not,
That
I
does
didn't make
not
this up last
diminish
night.
the great
And
profession.
interestingly,
Only
ultimately,
means that
both
in that
Rasher
ethics,
and Himmler,
thinking about the other person as a
Rasher
human being,
is
not
stripped
as a
of his
thing,
rank, kicked
applies
out of the
to all
Luftwaffe and SS,
professions
put into the
that deal
concentration
with human
camp,
beings,
and shot
and is
at the order of
indispensable.
Himmler.
I
Now,
love
there's a
the
great deal of
quote by Maxwell
speculation for the reasons
Anderson. I make
behind
it
I could
shorter
go
than
into
it
it, but I
is.
just
Then
don't
I
think
have
we
it.
time.
Science
So
is
it's
completely
an interesting
impartial.
character.
It doesn't give a damn which way you go.
Now,
It
how
can
about what
invent
did he
the
do
atom bomb,
professionally?
but it can't
He
tell
went to
you whether to use it
Decided
or not.
graduate at 35,
That's
36.
the difference, and it must be
And
recognized.
the highest he got in
So,
civilian life, he was
science
a
and
surgical,
technology
an unpaid
don't
surgical
equal
assistant. He was
humanity.
not a
That
superb
was Einstein's
doctor, a
dilemma,
great clinician.
and he was aware
spent
of
3
it.
years at the Schwabing
Now, I do
Hospital
think
in
that in
Munich
individual
as a surgical,
points we may
unpaid
disagree. I
assistant.
disagree with some of
His
the
research
speakers, especially
background
this
is
morning.
really checkered,
But I do think
and
that we
again, I
can
don't want to
put
go into
two
story.
basic values
Because of
down
he had problems
that are
with
measuring
submitting a
sticks
false
that are
application for
absolute
grants.
and have to be
He was
used at any
denied
time.
a appointment at the
Susan
University
said,
of Marburg.
you have to be a
They
mensch.
discouraged him from
I
applying at
just said
Frankfurt
it in a
and
different
Kiel.
way. The first
And they were
measuring
processing his
to
application at the
recognize
University
the
of Strasbourg, which,
importance
by
of
the
the
way, was an
dignity
SS
of
university,
each individual,
and Himmler hoped that he would get him
regardless
an
of
appointment
origin,
there. And
or
it's
age,
remarkable.
or gender, or
I think to some
whatever it
extent,
is, or religion.
it gives you a mixed message.
And the second
Because
is a
people at
responsibility
the University of
of
Marburg
people for each
had the
other.
guts to deny
All over
an
the world,
appointment
those values
at
have
the
been
request
expressed
of
by
Himmler.
many
So,
great religions, and I could quote, but I will
suppose
not do it,
anyhow.
so that other can also speak.
He is extremely controversial
The
in
Holocaust
along
has given us a
military and
stern
medical
warning.
leaders, and in spite of all
There
his
were
power,
other such
he
warnings
does
in
not
history.
get any
We
promotion
mustn't
at the height
forget lynching and
of his
torturing of
career.
slaves.
As far as research
a
activities
parallel.
are concerned,
Those have
he
shown what it
began
means when
to
we
play with
forget
some
basic
plant
human
extract,
values
cure,
and think of
to
people
cure
only
cancer,
as means.
perhaps a
In each
precursor of
case,
Laetrile.
whatever we
You
do,
heard about the
We must assess
high altitude
whether
experiments,
we are violating the principle of
hypothermia
the
experiments,
value
and
of
I
each
talked to you
human
about
being
polygol
and our
10,
responsibility for each
and
other.
one intention was to
Also,
retard clotting, the second
I
for
want
infection
here another
control.
point just
There
to
was
make
some
that because I've
question
heard
whether
it too
he
often.
did. He may have
Any
had to side from
argument
commercial
for the
production of
use
these
of
things and
Nazi
perhaps
data or
get financial
practice
benefit.
that uses
Himmler wasn't
always
happy
this,
about the
others
infection
did that
control
too,
qualities of
must
polygol.
be rejected.
So
I
anyhow,
hear too
that's his
often, well, the
scientific
Americans did it,
background
the
for
English did
research
it.
activities.
That no
let's look at
lynching
it. Just
or
a few
racist
comments.
theories that
How was
occurred
he
in the
regarded by
United
his
States,
superiors?
or
What was
all
his
these
scientific
theories that
image?
they presented in the
Himmler
20s, and I
thought
read
that he
those
was
very
not
carefully.
sufficient for the
None of them
qualification of these scientifically
excused
extensive
any
and difficult
torture that
questions.
happened under the
We're
Nazis
talking about the
and
high
what happened
altitude
in the
experiments,
Holocaust.
so he's asking some good
Nor
scientists to
any
help
torture
Rasher.
in the Holocaust
Rasher,
excuses
for
any
example,
one
these
of
are
us
isolated
of a
episodes.
single
Rasher sends a
discrimination
memo
or
to
racial
Himmler
slur
sends
in
it
this
back to him,
country
put it in
or
better
anywhere
German.
in the
Now,
world. There's no
I
excuse
think that,
because somebody else does it.
I suppose it's somewhat
I
of
want
an
to
insult, and
underline
he
that.
cuts out 6 of the 7
And
items
finally,
that Rasher puts
as
into
to
his
the
memo.
responsibility
Gebhardt, who
of,
was
the
director of
the kind of the
German Red
intellectuals
Cross,
of, we have talked about. Here, yeah, then
Himmler's
and now.
doctor, a very
I
high
happened to be for
position.
30 years a member of the University
Rasher
of
quoted him
Minnesota.
saying that
But it shames me to really
Gebhardt had
to
a meeting
think
with him
that
about
members
the
of a
dry freezing
university
experiments, not the
would
wet
want
freezing
to use
experiments.
bogus
And
knowledge
basically Gebhardt
gained
said the
under
report was
inhuman
unscientific. If a student of the
circumstances.
second term
To
submit
me,
a thesis of that kind, he would throw him
universities
out.
and the
Now
free
these are
press
the
are
German
the two
SS.
institutions
These
that are
are
the
Jews
most
in
important
concentration
safeguards of a
camps.
free
These are
society.
not
And when
prisoners
they
or
fall,
whatever you
we
call
lose.
them. These were his superiors.
But I know that they can be
Now let's look at the organization
just as
of the
they were in
Dachau
Germany.
cooling experiments.
Not
Himmler
every
has
one
no
of the
scientific
professors,
background,
both Jews
or at
and
least not
non-Jews
medical
at the
background.
German
He fancies
universities
himself a scientist,
agreed with
and
the Nazis.
by law or
But
by
very
edict, he
many
has
were
to
very silent.
approve all human
Those
experimentation
who
in
worked
concentration
actively
camps.
with them did the
In
medical
many instances, he
so-called
dictates the
experiments.
protocol
I
and
think that's
overrules
simply criminals.
qualified
The
investigators.
so-called clean hands
And he controls
and
the
fine
people, he
titles
can give them
and
money,
a darn
rank,
good employment.
and as you saw in Rasher's
think we
situation, he
forget
controls life. So he's a
that
pretty
money
powerful
is a
figure.
wonderful incentive
Rasher
to commit
originated
crimes.
the use of
And we also
prisoners.
forget that
It was
good
his idea.
intellects can find rationalization for any atrocity. That is
Okay,
the danger
I'll
of the
try to speed
intellectual.
up. I think this
Solzhenitsyn
slide just shows
what
you
is the
that
most precious
the
thing in the
organization
not
was
to
basically Rasher and
participate in
Himmler.
injustice.
And I'd
They
like
are
to make just
stronger
a
than
comment about the
They have existed
two
in the past,
qualified
they will
help that
exist in the
Rasher had
future.
on the
But let them not
hypothermia
come about
experiment,
through you.
Finke and Holzlohner.
I
Yes, they
think,
were qualified,
and
they
here I
came with
speak
him,
partially to
they
the
helped him. Rasher
medicine and many other professions to which we
was
belong.
ruling the situation,
Too easily
but
one can
after
sway-
50
be
experiments,
by personal
Holzlohner
ambition,
and
comfort that surrounds
Finke left.
people in
They felt that the
universities,
experiments were
and let
completed,
things just
we don't need
happen.
any more.
Greed
And
and
Rasher
arrogance,
felt that he
to
needed
me,
to
are the
complete
two
his
cardinal
thesis for
sins. We need people
an
with
equivalent of a
courage,
PhD,
with
and he went on to do
absolutely no
350
arrogance
more experiments
because of
on
their
his own
position,
without the
or because they are
so-called
so darn
professional
intelligent and maybe
withheld.
they aren't, or their race, or whatever. They
This is the
have to
experimental
act
design
according
very
to
quickly.
conscience.
There were, I
I'm
use
ending only with a
the
word by
Germans use it
Michael
for
Scott,
Versuchung,
who is
I use
very
it for
active
victims,
in the
so
fight against
we use the same
apartheid
letters
in
for
South
different
Africa.
purposes.
Because usually these
there
people
were
say things better
280
than
to
I can
300
say
victims.
them, and all he said was,
Some of them had
if you
multiple
believe in
experiments,
the
and
dignity of
importantly
men,
there were 80
you
to
must
90 deaths.
uphold it
Now,
wherever
if
it
you
is being
read Rasher's
disregarded.
report, you
I think that's what we
don't
learn
know
from
how
the
many
Holocaust.
people there were. There's nothing in his report about the number of people in the experiments. And if this were a superb experiment and it was sent to the New England Journal, they would send a paper back. If you provide us this information, since the rest of the material is good, we would accept it. But if you can't provide this information, it's unacceptable. As far as
introduce myself other than
informed
to say
consent
I'm
is
Charles
concerned, most
Carroll.
of them were forced. Occasionally,
what time I
a victim
have
was promised that if he goes through, or
thanking
I'm sorry, they were all he's. If he goes through the
those who
experiment,
organized this
they
conference
would give
and
him
for
pardon.
those
and frequently Rasha was playing
of whatever
a bride
mind
game.
they might be,
Now the victims were
for having
placed.
come and spoken
You see that in
frankly
water,
to these issues.
2 degrees centigrade is essentially freezing.
As
Or they
Amos
were
said, the
put outside
Holocaust
naked
is a
in the
Jewish
cold,
tragedy,
9 to 14 hours,
but it is
and they
also
were
one
pulled to
of all
25 degrees.
humanity. And I would
Now, we don't know how many
identify
were
myself with
naked, how many
mankind.
were had protective clothing when
I'd
they went
also
into the
like to
bath.
say that I think the
Age,
time
weight,
has
general
come
condition
that some of
unavailable.
us reread
Now, these were
a
concentration camp
volume that
inmates,
appeared in
emaciated.
Europe in
Obviously, their
1946
resistance
that was written by Max
was not the
Picard,
same as a
entitled Hitler in Our
person
Cells.
outside of the camps. In addition, it's pretty well-known
As this
information that
conference
fat
comes to a
protects to
close,
some
I would
degree
venture
against
to
cooling.
suggest that
So
it
it would
will
have been
prove
nice
one
to
of the
know
most
what kind
significant of our
of
times.
subjects or victims are these.
For
Are
what
they
was
emaciated?
said
We don't know that.
and for what was left unsaid.
As far as the experimental
I
protocol,
predict
it's
that it
not
will lead
provided,
to
it
still
seems
other
haphazard,
conferences
whatever
in the years to
I
come.
think as Susan Vigorio said,
Man
if he was
is
mad
not
one morning, he did this
one-dimensional.
experiment. If he was in
History
good
is
spirits, then
not
he did something else.
one-dimensional.
I suppose it's maybe
And
a clone.
ethics cannot be
Or your
fashioned
friend.
without a multi-dimensional view of man and
Mengele.
history, and without a
They had the same
multidisciplinary study
temperament.
by scholars
Okay?
willing to engage in civil
We don't know
discourse,
how many people in each group.
humbly
We don't know
accepting the
what was
fact
the end point of this
that
experiment.
nothing equals
Was it
the ignorance
a certain
of
amount
modern
of time? Was it
philosophers
a certain degree
in
of
matters of
temperature? Or
science.
was it death?
except the ignorance
Some of them
modern
remarkably did get
scientists in
sedation.
matters of philosophy.
And
As so
it
well
seems
stated
that
by
while
the late
Holtzlohner and
Etienne
Finkel were
Gilles.
around, they were given some sedation,
There are
but we
ghosts
don't know
other than
who did
those
get and who
that
did
have been
not get
named
sedation.
to date
It's not
in
specified.
this room.
We don't
There's
know
a
who,
ghost of
why
George
somebody was put in
Orwell who
clothes
wrote,
and who was put in naked and how
Who
many.
controls the
Again,
past
the level
controls
of
the future.
change in the level of the
And
bath
who
temperature between
controls
2 to
the
12
present
degrees is significant, not
Controls the
specified.
past.
As far as monitoring and data
As the
collection is
ghosts of many
concerned,
others of whom
we don't know
Susan
anything
Vigorio
how
last night made us
frequently
all
any
mindful
of the parameters
that
were
at no
measured.
point in
Temperature,
this
heart rate,
conference have
blood
we
sampling,
discussed the
or any of
nature
that
of
stuff.
man.
And just to give you an example, this is
But
a
D.M.
figure from the
Templemore,
Baja.
in his work Plus ou moins bête, wrote,
Okay,
all
this is a
man's
slide
troubles
from
arise
the,
from the fact that we do not know
one
what
of
we
the
are,
experiments,
and
and
we
you
do
see,
not
you have a
agree
curve.
on what we want
Now,
to
if
be.
you
An old world is dying,
construct this
new world is
curve
being
by having a
born.
sample here, here, and here,
and we may, as
then
St.
you
Jerome
know that
on
the
the
curve is
sack of
reliable.
Rome in
But
410
if you have
throw
a
up our
sample
hands
here
and
and a
cry,
sample there, then
if
your curve
Rome
is
can
totally
perish,
unreliable.
what can
We
be
have
saved?
no information that would tell
Or
us
we may, with St. Augustine,
that the
turn
curve
to
is
the
reliable.
task that has
How
set
many
us
points do they make
and build a
makes
bridge
up
to
this
the future
curve?
comparable
What
to
is
the
the
one he
variation?
built,
So anyhow,
which led from
it's useless
classical
data.
antiquity to what we still call the
the
modern
blood
era.
pressure is not measured. No
nuclear fission
cardiogram
made
is taken
possible
during
the
cooling,
development
which is
of the
really a
atomic
crucial
bomb
piece of
and the
information.
possibility of a nuclear holocaust. So now discovery of the genetic
Now,
code makes
the results
possible
are
a genetic
expressed in terms of
holocaust.
generalizations, anecdotes,
And we have
sweeping
Benno Miller-Hill
conclusions,
to
and
thank
no
for making us mindful
really
of the
backed up with
enormity
real
of the problem the
factual
life
data.
sciences face.
As
the
far as the
physical
rate of
sciences
cooling is
before
concerned,
them.
he says that the water temperature
ghost of
and the
C.S.
presence
Lewis
of
in this room,
anesthesia are
too.
irrelevant because there is so much individual
Growth
variation
in the
in different
evolution of
subjects.
man,
Why we
each
don't
new
know
power won
how much
by
is the
man
variation,
is a
and the
power
fact that the
over
influence
man
of
as
temperature, water temperature, and anesthesia are eliminated.
We have
it
Robert
proves that
Proctor to thank for his monumental
we can't
work
rely
on
on it.
racial hygiene
Now, we
medicine
know 80
under
or
the
90
Nazis.
people died. He provides us information
So there are
on
those
6
among us who
poor
wish that
victims.
we might
And
have
as you
shown
see,
greater
he
awareness than
claims that the
Francois
temperature
Bale
at the time of
or
death
Philippe
of those
Assis
victims was
of the United
24.2
States
to
versus
25.7 degrees
so-called Russia
centigrade,
case,
and these were the figures that Dr.
which,
Poses
unlike the medical
gave us
case,
yesterday. Now look at
reported in
the
detail
figure
on the abortion
that accompanies, backs up this
Eastern
information.
workers,
If you look at the third
taking
column,
away the infants
that's
of
the
Eastern
temperature at the time
workers,
of death. You see
punishment
that
for
the range is
sexual
between
intercourse with
25.7 and
and
29.2.
hampering the reproduction
Now,
of enemy nationals.
Could it be a typing
Why
error?
this has so
I
long
suppose.
been
I don't know,
kept
but I've
a
seen this
secret in this
repeatedly.
country,
These
I
are
leave you to
his
think
data
out
in the
for
text
yourselves.
and his information on the
For as early as Rolf
I'm sorry,
Hochhuth's
I had a
play,
guy
The
who was pushing
Deputy,
me.
he made mention of those women of Ukrainian and Polish nationality and
I could go on.
who
For
were taken
example,
by the
I could go on, but obviously I don't have the
Soviet
time. I have a
Union,
lot of this type of material
forced to work in the war industries of the
that
Reich,
to me,
and in order
and I'm
not to
truly
interrupt war
convinced,
production,
to
forced to
any
submit to monthly intrauterine examinations
disinterested
and have found
and
pregnant
straightforward
aborted.
scientists would show very clearly that this does
best
not have any place
Secret
in
of the
scientific
post-war
literature.
years is to be found in that
I also
book.
would like to show you very
of the
quickly
trial.
that a paper comes out
Then
from
it was
Germany from
only in
another
1987
investigator.
during the Nuremberg conversations in Nuremberg itself, in
Gross
June of that
Brockhoff,
year, that many
published in
Germans
Germany in
became conscious for the
1943.
first time of the fact that
This
there
is
was not
animal
one
work,
trial at Nuremberg,
and it's impressive. It's
but
good
rather
work.
13.
So this was not the level of
first before
science
the
of
International
Germany
Military
in
Tribunal,
1940s. This
12
was the level
additional
of science of
trials known
Himmler,
as the subsequent
Lasher,
proceedings
and Dachau.
before the American
So it's not
Military
that
Tribunal.
time just did not
I
have the
came
knowledge.
here in complete agreement with Dr.
I have very
Kaplan's view
briefly, in terms of,
that
again,
the
why
imagery
use
of
it?
the
Do we
Holocaust
need
is
it?
invoked
And
in
again, if I
contemporary
look at the panel
disputes about matters
feels
in
it's irrelevant
bioethics
whether we need it or
with
not.
little
But I'm just
sensitivity
trying to
of what
sort of
actually
support the
happened in
position,
medicine,
and just to show you.
public health,
There's been a tremendous
nursing,
advance in
and the
knowledge and
biological
technology
sciences
over
in
the last
Germany
40 years, and a
during the
great deal
Nazi
of
period.
research data have been collected
and I believe that
from the
that
literature.
condition will
As far as
continue
accidental
unless we
hypothermia
study
data, some people claim we don't
first
have
the
it.
trends
Claim
of
we don't have
medicine in the
enough.
19th and 20th
No, in
centuries,
England,
and
up
face
to
the question
3.5%
posed at the
of
Free
the
University of
hospitalization
Berlin in
over at the age of
1980.
65 is for
Medicine and
hypothermia.
National
I mentioned to you
Socialism
last night the
forbidden
hypothermic
past
operations,
or unbroken
300,000 a year in the U.S.
One of the most
Hypothermia,
interesting
as you know, is used
chapters
for
in
organ
19th
preservation,
century medical
transplantation,
history is to
for
read
blood and organ
the
storage,
experiments
and
that
finally,
began already as
this
early
is
as
a little bit about the
1835 in
technology.
Dublin
I spent a year in
by Dr.
Scotland in
William
1960, and
Wallace
we were
by
doing
inoculating the eyes of
open
newborn
heart surgery
poor
under hypothermia, and this was the
gonococci,
setup. This is a little
only
girl
to
just
find
before
that
her
experiment
operation. I'm not going to go into the
repeated time
detail
and
of
time
she's
again
anesthetized.
until a
I'm
Dr.
not going to
Schnepp
go into
in
detail how
France,
this works, but this was a
some
highly
22
efficient
years later,
system,
wrote in a marvelous way and said,
warming
I do
and
not
cooling,
need to
safe,
write
because
the Iliad in
the little
order
girl
to
was
prove
monitored,
it could be done
and
by
honestly, I knew that hypothermia experiments were going on at Dachau.
Second, the
But
intellectual
when
and
I worked
cultural
with this one, I
history
had
of Europe.
no idea that
The role of Hegel,
information could be of any
as you
use to
find
anybody.
reflected in Thomas
And
Kuhn's
so,
structures
I
of
think we can exist
scientific
without
revolution.
Rasher.
The
Finally, a
principle of
last
mediation,
slide.
the movement
Now, this
from
is a man
paradigm to paradigm in
who
science,
was
which
exposed to
leaves little
hypothermia,
room for
and
ethical
he's being
discussion.
reborn with the heart and lung machine.
Marx,
You don't
the
have to open
development
the
of
chest, you just hook
scientific
some
materialism.
tubes into their groin.
Darwin, and
Now, I just
though,
wanted
as
to
Isaiah
show you
Berlin says, ideas
The
have careers
sophistication
of
of
their
the
own.
equipment.
The movement
All
from
kinds of
Spencer
monitors around
to
him.
William Graham
At the foot
Sumner
of the bed
to
is the heart
social
and lung machine.
Darwinism in the United States,
You know, it's
as
inconceivable
outlined by
to me
Richard Hofstadter,
if we can
and the
use this tool,
contrary
and we have
move
used it for 20,
from Sir
25
Francis
years.
Galton to the
Then
eugenicists of
forget about the
Germany
cruelty.
in the 19th century.
I just don't see how
The part played by militarism
we can
and
use Rasher's
industrialism
information.
in
I
the
have to say
movement
just
from
one other
dynastic
thing on
wars,
printing.
as practiced
I
by
forgot
Frederick
about
the
this.
Great,
On
to
autopsy, I
people's
probably
wars
forgot
as
about many things, but I
experienced
think
in the
this is
time of
crucial.
Napoleon,
At autopsy,
to
it was
total
found
war as espoused
that
by
most of the
Ludendorff
victims had a half a
and
liter of blood
practiced in
in their
World
brain.
War II.
Now,
And I
blood
might
does
say
not
for
come
those
from
of you who are
hypothermia.
interested in the body count,
Thousands and thousands of people are cooled and they
numbers
do
that
not
been
have
killed
blood
in
on their
wars,
brain.
there's a distinct
As far as
relationship
the best I can
between
tell,
those losses
this must
and
have
what
come
we
either from
discussed
beating
here,
them,
as was mentioned
or the
yesterday
poor
by one
people
of
were
our
struggling
speakers
so hard
who referred to Oliver
that they
Wendell
must have
Holmes
injured themselves.
in
One of the
referring
two.
to those who could be
And this is
sterilized
clearly
in face
described.
of young men who had
This is the human
sacrificed
element
for their
of it.
country.
The scientific
Mr.
aspect
Justice
of it
Holmes'
is
arguments were cited by
that if you
Arthur
have
Root
blood on the brain,
exposition of the law for the prevention of
which
congenital ill
exerts
progeny,
pressure on the
or
brain.
the law on compulsory
The brain
sterilization of
has a temperature controlling
1943.
center, and this pressure on the brain can influence the
By
function of the temperature controlling
By
center,
limiting
which means
the only facts
that if
we
you have a
consider
person
those that are scientifically
who's,
verifiable.
undergoes experimental
materialism.
hypothermia and has
Let me tell
blood
you,
on his
materialism has
brain,
many meanings.
then you're not measuring
And Susan
your intervention
Vigorito
or
again
your
this morning
testing of the
spoke of
hypothermia.
herself
You measure that,
as viewed as
sure,
material.
but you also measure
In the
somebody who has
19th
brain
century,
injury,
three
and
doctors
it's
in
unpredictable how that person would react to injury. I'm sorry, I would have liked to present the whole material because I think it would have been much more convincing, but obviously
in the early
the boss
70s, in
won't
the
let
New
me.
England Journal of Medicine appears an article in its title reference
I
being
could have
made to
discussions
human
with the panel
products of
members, and I
consumption.
may not totally agree with them
Is it not time
in every
to
way
discuss
about the use.
nature of man?
I would have some problems.
And
if
biologism,
I had a patient,
discussed at Nuremberg, not
and I
by
was
Dr.
told, I
Ivy,
think
but
it's
by Werner
unlikely,
Leibrand,
most unlikely, but
who
a
was
hypothetical
the representative of the
situation. I had a
German
patient,
community of
an
medicine
8-year-old
and
girl or
expert
boy,
witness for the
and I'm
prosecution.
told
As
she has
well
some
as Virchow
problems,
and
and if I
Nietzsche
go to the library
in the
and find
genesis of
Dr. Rascher's
utopian
work,
ideologies
and there's
in
something in
medicine,
it that
as
can
outlined
save the
by
life of
Heinrich
this girl.
Schippergus,
And
the
with this
professor
girl
of
are
history
her
of
parents,
medicine
her brother, her
at
sister,
Heidelberg.
maybe her grandmother,
of
and
Wagner
I'm the
in the
guy
revival of
who
the
makes the
occult,
decision. Now,
and
it's
of
easy
Weber
to sit in the
in the
panel here
espousal of value-free
and
methodology.
say, don't use it. You know,
Third, the
I became
transmutation
almost
of language
preoccupied
into the lingua
with
tertii
the dead.
imperii.
but I hate death.
The initial
And I
is given
certainly
in
don't want
notebook
to
kept
be
by Victor
an actor
Klemperer,
or a
a Jewish
participant
philologist in what now is Eastern Germany, who
in
survived the war,
being responsible for the death of
The
an
language
8-year-old
of the
girl.
Third Reich,
So I would have real problems
in which he made
making that
mention of the
decision.
use of language
I
then,
think when you discuss this
as
whole
Mrs.
biomedical
Vigorito
ethics,
this morning,
again, it's easy to
and the
talk
increasing frequency of references made to human
in a
subjects
building that has some
as
green ivy
histological
on
and
it,
anatomical material,
nice rooms, bookshelves, and so
to
on.
say nothing of the
I think it's a different
euphemisms of
proposition when
evacuation,
you're faced
resettlement,
with a difficult
special treatment,
situation, people, emotion,
employed during the
family
Holocaust,
relationship.
or
I
the
think
subtle
that
changes
so
from
alters the situation a little
sterilization
bit.
to
Thank you very
prevention
much.
of congenitally ill progeny, abortion to interruption of pregnancy, mercy killing to mercy death, extermination
Dr.
to
Berger.
final
Thank you,
solution,
Susan. Thank you,
from
Keith.
malformed,
Thank you, Father
retarded,
Carol.
and
One of the
chronically
things that's been
ill to
interesting
empty
at
husks,
the conference
asocial,
and prior
useless
to it
eaters
is to watch
living lives
and
unworthy
hear different
to be
people
lived.
suggest how to do it. Listen
C.S.
to
Lewis
different
again
people
proves a
suggest
ghost here.
what they do or don't like.
For
as to
he
what
in the
goes on.
abolition of man
I
cited the
told
use
you,
of language
in the end, I guess
to destroy
I'm responsible.
or
We haven't
to
had much
affirm
talk about responsibility and guilt,
human values.
but I feel guilty and responsible.
I'd also
so
like
I'll
to
say
pay
so.
note to one of our
about
speakers
how
who
the thing
talked to
has
the
been
need of
organized.
describing
And I told you that
personhood
there's been attention
and
to
tell you how far it's gone in
who
our
comes
own
where.
culture.
And I, for one,
In the latter part of the last
simply end the meeting
century,
by saying,
in the state of
I'm
California,
sorry
in a
that you
case
didn't have
known
time
as
to
the
have the
County
mic
of
open, but
Santa
I've never
Clara versus
regretted
the
listening
Southern
to anything
Pacific
I
Railroad.
heard during the
The Southern
conference.
Pacific
Because I know
Railroad
that
was
different people
recognized as
are
a person.
trying to struggle
as a
with their
corporation.
experience in different ways, or to
In
bring
Sierra
lessons
Club
that they want to
versus
teach
Morton, in a
in
decision by
different
Mr.
vocabularies and
Justice
voices.
Douglas,
So I'm not
he
disturbed
argued
at all
that trees
in some
and
sense
rivers
that we
and
did
air
hear
should
from
be
lots of
granted
voices and lots of
personhood that we
vocabularies
might
and lots of
protect
perspectives,
them.
and we watch people struggle.
Ask yourself
I think
then
that's good.
the
I
relationship
hope,
between
as I
those
said, that the mic
words and the
stays
decision of the
open
court in
now
Roe versus Wade.
to give us an opportunity maybe in
And
the
look
future
what's
to have
happened
more
in some of our
conferences
lesser courts.
to
There's the
look at the
case of
Holocaust,
Strunk versus Strunk in
to
Kentucky,
understand its significance for bioethics.
where the
Maybe
kidney
we'll
of a
have conference
retarded
with some
brother was
bioethicists
ordered by
in
the
audience,
court
who
to be
knows?
given to his
There weren't
brother
many at
to
this
save
one.
his life.
But
Only
I also
one
am pleased
judge
that we have the record.
said
and I will
this
do what I
reminds
can
me
to
too much of
promote
what
it.
happened in another country
make it available,
in our
publish
time
the proceedings,
with
get
fatal
the tapes to those who want to see
consequences
them,
for humanity.
get the tapes to some who don't know they
Or
ought
the
to see them.
case of in the state of Ohio known as in
that
Ray,
will
Nora,
be, I
and
think,
Peterson,
good legacy of the
where
conference. So thank you
sterilization
for
is ordered
coming.
not for eugenic reasons, as in the case of Buck versus Bell, but economic reasons. No, listen carefully to Raoul Hilberg. It began with definition, expropriation, concentration, and it ended with extermination. And the power to define is the power to destroy.
To be a very difficult
Let me also say that there's been
exploration,
little
if you
mention
will,
in this
independent of questioning other matters of ultimacy,
and you cannot
of
conduct a
origins of
practice
life,
medicine
purpose
without
of life,
law, and you
why is
cannot
there
hope
evil,
to
why do the good
institute an
suffer,
ethical system
what can I
without
do, if anything, to make a difference?
Well, therefore,
So
fourth, I'd
it may
suggest
be
that we
just personal
study
bias
the
that
abandonment
allows me
of
to
the studies in
consider ethics in
jurisprudence
a,
and concern with law
in a more holistic,
until
systematic way,
law, and this was
where it
written
is
in the last century,
different from, but not separate from
so far as
theology or
its
philosophy.
content or substance goes,
My
is
bias
engulfed in the
definitely is that
idea of utility.
I feel
So
if we
far
are
as
going to
its
respond
power,
ethically to the
efficacy
issues
is
that will be
concerned,
facing us
it's
scientifically and
engulfed in the
technologically
idea
and medically,
of force.
that we best
From the
see
quest for justice
these ethical
to the quest
questions
for
in a more holistic
utility,
way and as
to the
part of
point that
a
it became
more
merely the
historical
expression of the
process
sovereign's will.
and not employ the more limited
Fifth, the
and
denigration of
self-centered,
the individual and the
generationally speaking,
exaltation of the
self-centered view
Gemeinschaft as
that
the
Western
primary
human beings, I
patient.
feel, not always, but
Assumption
too
by
often
the
are
party
guilty
state of the
which
role of
limits our
primary
vision
physician,
and understanding of the
rejection
past,
of
not
the
vision for the future.
absolute
So
value
I
of
choose to
life,
see
and
ethics
with
in
it,
that
the
context.
absolute
Academically
value of the
speaking,
individual.
I am
Susan
sure
Di
could,
Garrido was
someone
that,
could very cogently
just
argue
a
with me.
number,
Perhaps
and
the person
so
who wrote the
was
question.
everyone who was in the extermination
Questions
camps
addressed
of
to
the
the
Third
panel.
Reich.
What makes moral choices so culturally discrete that they are incapable of being
Finally, I
compared
think
and
we should study the
contrasted?
secularization of the European mind and the repudiation of Judeo-Christian
I, for one-
morality
I,
and
for one, don't think that they
anthropology.
are. I know. I mean, I think
One
a couple of
very
other people,
interesting
and
thing,
Dr. Cranford will
Arthur
probably want to
Gut in that
respond
same
to
work
this,
in
and I
which
agree
he
with his analysis
expounded
that sometimes
the
the
meaning of the
cultural
law for the prevention
and
of
factual
congenital
basis from one culture to
progeny
another means
said,
that you
"Love
cannot
of
translate
neighbor has to
policies,
go."
practices, and laws because cultures are
And a
unique.
Jew who
It
today
doesn't
is
follow from that, and I think he
minister of
made
the
that point
Church of
very well
Scotland
with
in a
the
book
experience
entitled
in
The
the
Sin
Netherlands
of
with euthanasia,
Compassion.
and that one can't just pick something up from one culture
Spoke
and dump
of
it
how
down
much
wholesale in another culture and expect it to
compassion
work
was
the same
considered a
way.
sin
I
in
think
the
that's
Third Reich.
undeniable. At the same time, as I heard the
In
way
Life,
this
in
question
an
was
article by
phrased,
Robert
let me see it
Ardrey in the
again.
early 70s,
The
there
question
was a
says,
little
what makes
line,
moral
"Quality
choices
has
so culturally
sacrificed the
discrete that they are
pardon me,
incapable of
compassion
being
has
compared and
sacrificed the quality
contrasted?
of
I
life."
would actually disagree with the
In
premise
the
and say
Milwaukee
that they
Journal
are
in the
capable
mid-70s
of being
appeared an
compared and
article
contrasted. If
from
they
Little
could
Rock,
not,
Arkansas,
we could
announcing that
perfectly well
Nelson
sit here and
Rockefeller
say,
said
well,
that the
what was
Christian
right for the
ethic is
Germans
in a
was right for
collision course
them,
with
and that
free
was the
enterprise,
Nazis, and that was their
and
ethic.
that
We may
love
want to
of
have a
neighbor
different
would
one
have
here,
to
but
go.
that was their business to do it. I think there's a
Leo
pernicious
Alexander,
premise
whom I knew
underlying the
personally
view
and
that
loved,
from one cultural setting we cannot criticize
said to me
another.
one
That, I
time,
think, is the path to
"There is a
a
difference
very
between those who
morally
regard their fellow
bankrupt
human
kind
beings
of
as
ethical
common creatures of a
relativism,
common
one that
creator,
says no culture can
and those
ever,
who
or
view
no
them
culture
as
or
mere
cultural group can
conglomerates
ever
of
be morally
biologicals and
critical of
chemicals.
another culture. If we accept that, we might as
The
well
Western
then
world
accept
in
the
large
Nazi ethics
part
as
has
right for them.
accepted the advice
And that's a
of
conclusion I
Voltaire,
refuse to draw.
"Écrasez l'enfant," erase the abominable thing,
I would
which is
agree with
religion.
The
The Western world has forgotten his if-then.
articulately.
Si Dieu
2 years ago, you
n'existait
could have said
pas,
that in some settings, and you would have been.
il faudra l'inventer.
Maybe still today.
If God did
But I
not
also
exist, it would
referred
be
to that
necessary
in
to
my,
invent
in
it.
my talk, where we have
Reflect
to
for a
search
moment
out what
upon
is
the gods we
perhaps
have
absolutely
invented.
true
Race,
in this relative
folk,
world. That doesn't mean that there
class,
aren't certain absolute
science,
truths. And we don't
self.
have to endorse cannibalism in one culture
Then ask
simply
how we
because
can
they've been
endure
doing it for thousands of
without
years.
an overarching
Some,
system of
of course,
values
would argue that,
rooted in
it's a more gray,
some
more
meaningful
gray issue
theology or
than
philosophy
black and white,
of life.
as I just stated it. But
Finally, it
that's another
seems to
reason
me
why I think
we
this
must ask
question
whether
of
the
ethics
Holocaust was
has to
one,
be seen in a more
a
ultimate
momentary
context,
aberration in the history
involving
of the
a lot
German
vectors,
people,
if you will, We
Or
can't separate
two,
it out and just limit
a
it.
culminating event in the history of Europe,
I think one specific example
Or
of this
three,
that I have a lot of difficulty
symptomatic
with,
of a
and I have no idea what
disease
the
that has
answer is,
become
is this
endemic
absolute
to the
prohibition
West.
against killing by physicians. I think there's so
Franklin
many
Bauer
strong
of Yale wrote upon
reasons
the
why that
almost
should prevail
indiscernible shift
that one could argue
in
that this is an
emphasis
absolute
from
prohibition
being to
regardless of the
becoming
culture. And I'm
in
sure a lot
his
of people
modern
argue that way.
European thought.
The difficulty I have with that
Continuity
is
and
that if you
change
put it
in
in a certain
ideas,
culture and you find
1600
out
to
that the physicians are
1950.
causing more suffering by the policies
We
they
must
have,
first ask ourselves who we
is there
are
a conflict between the duty of a physician
before we
not
can
to
ask
kill,
ourselves what we
which
wish
is so
to
strong,
become.
but also of the
Should we not
physician
do
not
so,
to cause unnecessary suffering.
Others will ask,
It seems to me
and
that
their
if we
answers
continue
will
in the
be
trend we
imposed
have,
upon us as they
that
have
there may be a
been
situation
before
where you
in
could
this
argue
century.
that the physicians,
An
by causing a great deal
oft-overlooked
of suffering,
tragedy of the
have
days
forfeited
of the Weimar Republic
killing.
and the Third Reich
and I have no idea the
is
answer to
that
that.
which
This is
befell
something that
those
bothers
who
me. Again, I have
well-intentioned
more
people
questions
of the
than answers,
20s
but I think it's a
who
specific example
sincerely
of cultural
contended for
relativism
sterilization
versus absolute principles.
upon demand
Would
of
any
the
of the
patient,
panelists like to
abortion on
address?
demand of the patient, euthanasia upon demand of the patient, only to see them demanded in the 30s and early 40s
without
by the party
the terminally
states.
ill, without
I could talk much
actually
longer,
causing-
but I'm
possibly
going to
causing their
conclude with
death,
just
and I
one
think that,
suggestion.
and then
That those of you
what we
who
can
have
offer in terms
concerned
of the relief
yourself
of
with the
suffering to the
Holocaust
living will
read the
prevent
minutes of the 20th session of the Penal
reduce the
Code
likelihood
Commission of the Reichsministry of
participating in
Justice on
any
April the
form of,
16th,
killing process.
1934,
I think that's what we
when
should strive for.
even
I think we should
before
have,
the law
use
for the
general word,
prevention
humane
of
care of the dying.
congenitally ill
But I think we
progeny
should strive
came
so
into
hard
force,
to provide
there
humane
was
care for the dying that the
discussion on
circumstances where one could justify your act of
sterilization,
euthanasia or
euthanasia.
physician-assisted suicide would be so
And
rare
I say without
that it
the
may be done in that
slightest
circumstance,
hesitation
but the
that when I
physicians
first
should
had the
still
pleasure
have
of
to run the
meeting Simon
possibility of
Wiesenthal,
criminal sanctions
and he who experienced the
and all other
Holocaust said
sanctions
to me,
in this
"Now, how did it
situation, and
happen?"
that may be possible.
And I said, you mean
that's what we
after
should strive for.
33 or before? He
But it's
said,
going a lot
"After
farther than we
33."
are today in terms of
I
stopping
mentioned
treatment,
first the law
in
for
terms
the
of
prevention
widespread
of
stopping of
congenitally ill
artificial
progeny,
nutrition and
and he
hydration,
said, "Genau,
which is clearly a
exactly."
medical treatment. If we continue
And
this
then I
insane
said to
policy
him, and then
of continuing
this
artificial nutrition
meeting
and hydration
and the
in patients in a
resultant
vegetative
eugenic
state,
abortions
we're
followed by
even
the
severely
political,
demented. Far
economic,
more
and
difficult issues
military
than we got today.
abortions.
And if we don't
He said,
develop a more rational
"Exactly."
policy there,
And I
including some
said,
very
then
tough
the
value
euthanasia
questions,
program,
of course we're going to shift over
and I
into
said the erection
to
of carbon
active euthanasia
monoxide chambers. He
and
said,
rational
exactly.
suicide,
And
which
I
would be
said that
unfortunate.
led to the prussic acid and the
The
chambers of
last
Auschwitz.
question today is, what happened to the
It's hard
patient?
for you to look at the past. It's hard for me.
I have to apologize
I'm of
both
German
to the
ancestry.
person who wrote the question and to the
The most loving,
entire assembled
kindly,
group and say,
soft-spoken
I don't know what
person
happened to the
I've
patient.
known in my life
I can
was
give
my
a brief
grandfather,
explanation
and
of
I
why.
had to sit
This
at
occurred in a
Nuremberg
hospital that has
and
an
watch
ethics
the
committee
trial
that I regularly
and
serve
sit
on.
with Germans who
Although I
opposed
don't
him and
work, I
Germans
don't do
who
my clinical
supported
work
him,
in that hospital,
and
I do it in a
ask
different
myself
hospital,
why.
but I sit on the ethics committee that meets
The
monthly.
why involves far more
When the
than
committee
Germany.
meets, we have
It involves
updates
a whole
of cases
period of
that
our
were brought
common
on
history.
previous meetings. And
And
since
to
that
study
was
the
a
Holocaust
quite
is
recent
to
case, it
study
happened 2 months ago, and
ourselves.
last month's meeting was canceled, we
Thank
did
you
not
very
have
much.
the update. I can tell you, though, that from a medical standpoint, and I think physicians on this panel and the audience will appreciate this, physicians expected this patient
Well, you know, I asked,
to die.
the
Remember, there were
speakers
7
to,
months that had elapsed.
look
They had
into
expected her
their,
to die
hearts
much
to see how
earlier,
long they wanted to
and
talk,
she
and they
was
decided they wanted
hanging
to talk a
on
long
for
time.
quite a
So,
period of time. I think the most
that's all
merciful
right.
circumstance and the
I
best
guess
for
I'm going to
everything
make
concerned
another one of my
would have been
command
if their
decisions.
predictions have come true within the last
not gonna
month.
have questions,
Nevertheless,
since we have to go out of the room.
because the
So I'm
committee,
gonna
the
have
ethics committee was
Dr.
not
Berger
a decision-making
give his
body,
presentation,
but rather a
maybe
forum for
you
discussion,
can take some solace
analysis,
if you
and
wanted to go to the mic,
recommendations to the
at the idea
physician
that
and
it
providing moral
stands,
support to physicians who bring the
empty for some
cases.
of the,
It's not as though, and we should not
innocent
come away
ghosts.
with the mistaken impression that the committee
And maybe
had to
it will,
decide right
be an
then and
opportunity
there.
or
So I
symbol
apologize
for,
for my
what some
ignorance,
of
but
our
it is a
commentators
reminder
have
to me,
asked
which
for
I have
already, which
forgotten
is
in the
more
past,
study and
that
more
when I
reflection, so that we
present
can go,
material about cases, I
maybe
should
to
pretty
the mic on
well
another
check things
occasion.
out to find out if there was an outcome before I come and present them in a public forum. Thank you.
Well, thank you
Thank
all
you.
for your questions.
I guess
It's very
you know my
hard to
name.
select from the many that I
By
got
way of
here. We
qualifications,
will adjourn
I'm a
now for
Holocaust
lunch
survivor.
and reassemble at 2 o'clock.
Primarily, I'm a
Thank you.
surgeon, but have done quite a bit of clinical
I think we
scientific
dovetailed
research.
nicely here. Now, could I?
And you saw last night that I can get into trouble, but I believe that this time, I may have been upset last night, but I believe this time the trouble is worthwhile. I think I am I hope represent scientific truth, and also, perhaps more importantly, the memory of those who can't be here today. I also realized this morning, as I listened to Ms. Konopka, that I'm much more of a hypothermia student than I thought I was. An episode came back to me. I was 15, roaming around in Europe. At that time I was with the Russian army, didn't have a great deal of food, and we broke into a country estate looking for food. There wasn't much. We found jars of pickle, some jam, and we went down to the cellar, and there were these huge barrels of wine. So the Russians took their submachine guns, peppered the barrels with holes. The wine began to flow. Eventually, we had a foot or a foot and a half of wine on the floor of the cellar. Took some buckets, then some cups, went upstairs in a stateroom, and sat down at candlelight. There was no electricity, and began to drink wine, pickles, and jam. I was 15. I guess I didn't have a high tolerance for alcohol, and didn't take much before I wasn't completely oriented, went outside, fell in the snow, and fell asleep. And fortunately, Ms. Konopka isn't always correct, or her statistics aren't 100% accurate, because somehow the Russians came out, pulled me out, and I'm here today. I would also like to make a brief comment on Susan Vigorito's remarks. I was very moved by them. I think it's difficult to follow in her track, but she made the statement that the afternoon Mengele became the scientist, the cruel man. I don't think I feel that Mengele was either a scientist or that scientists have to be cruel people. And you did say that. Well, I'm sorry. Well, cool. I'm sorry. All right. Well, last night, as you saw, there was a fair amount of heat here. I didn't sleep much, not because I couldn't sleep, but I had some material with me, and I wanted to check into my facts, see if I was totally wrong and off balance, but I don't think I was. And I'm convinced now that the use of the Dachau data could not help, never mind save, a single human being. But I wanted to evaluate the scientific validity of the experiments, and I thought if the experiments were scientifically sound, then we have a big problem and a big debate on our hands. But if the data is unreliable and not valid, then the big question I have, should we continue to debate? So that was really my major interest in this whole situation. And it began about 8 months ago, and whenever I had time during the past 8 months, I was in the libraries, not looking for information in my own field, but about Nazi medicine, the Dachau experiments, and other experiments, and I read a great many documents, papers on hypothermia, and several books. I have here 4 pieces of documents that I think are the crucial documents. If anybody wants to look at them, I have them here in my briefcase. One of them is a report of a Combined Intelligence Objective Subcommittee. This is the Leo Alexander's report. This has 24 pages in English, and then about 45 pages with illustrations by Rascher and his cohorts in German, and I went ahead and with the help of a friend translated the German, so I have the stuff here, the translation, the German and the translation from the original German. Then I took prosecution exhibit number 91 from the Nuremberg trials, essentially the same material as in the Alexander report, except this was in English, official translation, and it does not have some of the material on animal rewarming and doesn't have the graphs. Then there's a book by two German physicians who were appointed by German Medical Society to be the official observers at the Nuremberg trials, and they wrote a book called Doctors of Infamy. It's fascinating to see how much interest there is in the Holocaust and this aspect of the Holocaust. I went to the Harvard Medical School library. This is a huge place, probably as good a medical library as you find in the country. Searched a great deal, eventually found it in the stacks on the 5th floor. Was obviously the paper was yellow, dusty, and as I look at the back of the book, it has never been taken out of the library. I'm the first one who used it. So I have that book. And then last week, Dr. Alexander left behind a huge cache of documents that he retrieved after the war. He was attached to the Nuremberg medical trials, and these were his papers, documents, interviews with some of the defendants, and their house now at the Boston University Library. So those are, as I said, I read a great deal of other material, but those are the key references. Now, I don't want to boast, but very briefly I'd like to just give you an idea of what my qualifications are to evaluate the scientific merits of a study like this. I published approximately 200 medical articles. I served on editorial boards of different medical journals. I review scientific communications for several medical journals, including JMA, New England Journal of Medicine, and so on. And from this experience, in my view, a report on a scientifically sound project should include the following information. And this isn't all-inclusive, but these are some of the key features. The total number of experimental subjects. We should know whether we're dealing with 2 subjects or whether we're dealing with 122. We have to know age, sex, weight, condition of the subjects, because this type of an information is crucial and may have a great deal of impact on interpretation of the results. We have to have a detailed description of experimental method. I hope I'm not getting too scientific here, but you know, I have the dilemma of trying to be objective, and I think that's what we need, an objective evaluation of this information. So we need an accurate description of experimental method, description of the subgroups within the experiment, how big is each group, what kind of intervention we use for each group, and then we have to describe the methods of measurement, data collection, and those are some of the highlights. Now, the conclusion should be based on factual data and not on speculation. Now, as far as the opinions about the Dachau experimentation, I just put this up very briefly just to tell you that the opinions are not straightforward. Some people say they're useless. Some people say there is no other and will be no other in an ethical world. There's an article written about this, and in 1984 at least 45 research articles quoted the Rasher experiments. And then the last man says the data are weak, but he uses them to corroborate more reliable experimental results. So it's not a straightforward situation. Now, in order to evaluate an experiment, I suppose as an editor, as a reviewer, these are some of the things that you look at. Usually, you know the character and credibility of the investigator, and I think that's pretty important. If you deal with an absolutely lunatic or unreliable person, then you can't expect reliable results. Well, motivation and goal. I think this is very important in this situation. We'll come to it later. Because you have to, none of us is pure. None of us is interested only in truth, science, and selfless. We all have our own agenda. But by and large, I think most scientists have a sense of decency and good motivation. Now we have to know a little bit about qualification of the investigator. Does he have the qualification to do any experiments? What is the organization? If it's a younger person, is he or she adequately supervised? Is there a sense of scientific freedom behind this paper? The design of the experiment, how is the research conducted? Is the data collection accurate, reliable, and how is it relevant?